Hello, my silent wanderers. Tonight, we travel to Mystic Falls, where the fog rolls in low off the roads, and the past is never quite finished with the present. This is the story of Damon and Delena, two people who were never supposed to happen, who collided in the dark and couldn't find their way back to before. A love that began with a lie, deepened through danger, and survived everything the world sent to destroy it. So, settle in. Let your breathing slow, and let the night carry you into a story where the wrong choice turns out to be the only one that was ever truly real. Eleanor Gilbert was 17 years old the night she met Damon Salvatore, and she didn't remember it until it was almost too late to matter. It was the night her parents died. The details of it lived in her body long after her mind had softened their edges. The way the road had been empty in the way roads are never empty. The fog sitting low and strange over the asphalt. The particular quality of silence that arrives just before something permanent happens. She and her parents had been driving home from a party she hadn't wanted to attend. A party she'd spend most of the evening slipping away from to sit with Stefan Salvatore. A boy she didn't yet know was a Salvatore. A boy she didn't yet know at all. She had asked her father to drive her home. Moments later, the car went off Wickery Bridge. What she did not know in the long months of grief that followed was that she had not been alone on that road before the accident. There had been a figure in the fog, a man, or something shaped like one, standing in the center of the asphalt as if the night belonged to him. She had stopped. She had spoken to him. And he had looked at her with eyes that shifted in the dark and said things that lodged themselves somewhere beneath her conscious memory, below the reach of ordinary thought. He had told her she wanted a love that consumed her, adventure and passion. He had told her she deserved all of it, and not to settle for anything less. Then he had compelled her to forget she'd ever seen him. His name was Damon Salvatore. And he was not, in any sense that mattered yet, a good man. The months following the accident folded into each other with the particular sameness of grief. Elena lived with her Aunt Jenna, looked after her brother Jeremy, went through the motions of a life that felt like it belonged to someone she used to be. She kept a journal. She smiled when people expected her to smile. She was, by every available measure, handling it, which mostly meant she had learned the particular performance of handling it without actually being anywhere close to fine. It was in this state, hollowed out, carefully composed, going through motions, that she met Stefan Salvatore. She was at the cemetery. He was watching her in a way that she would later understand was not coincidence, though at the time it felt like the universe offering her something gentle to hold on to. Stefan was quiet and attentive and present in the way that grief makes you hunger for. He asked about her. He listened to her answers. He was everything that the name Salvatore would not yet mean to her. They began something. It was slow and tender, and felt like climbing back toward the surface of herself, like her life might have color in it again after all. Stefan enrolled at Mystic Falls High School. He inserted himself carefully into her world, and she let him, because being around him was one of the few things that did not require the performance of being fine. Around Stefan, she could simply exist. She did not know yet what he was. She did not know yet that he had a brother. Damon Salvatore arrived in Mystic Falls in September, and he arrived like weather, sudden, disruptive, impossible to prepare for. He came back for Catherine Pierce, which was the reason he told himself, and which was true in the way that the simplest version of a complicated thing can be true. Catherine had been entombed beneath Fell's Church since 1864, or so he believed, and Damon had spent 145 years carrying that belief like a wound he refused to let heal. He would free her. He would find her. That was the entire architecture of his existence, the singular purpose around which everything else had been arranged. What he found instead was his brother's new life, a founding family town that still remembered the Salvatore, a council that hunted vampires with more competence than he'd expected, and a girl who wore Catherine's face. The first time Elena saw Damon properly, saw him knowing his name, knowing he was Stefan's brother. She felt the wrongness of him before she could articulate it. He was beautiful in the way that things made to be dangerous are beautiful, with a precision to his features and a quality of attention in his eyes that made you feel simultaneously seen and threatened. He smiled too easily. He said things that landed a half second before you understood them. He occupied rooms differently than other people did, as though the space rearranged itself around him rather than the other way around. He was also, in those early weeks, genuinely terrible. This is the part of the story that requires its own kind of honesty, because the truth of Damon Salvatore in the beginning is not softened by what comes later. He turned Vicky Donovan into a vampire and then killed her when she became inconvenient. He used Caroline Forbes as a blood source and a toy, compelling her memories, feeding from her, leaving bruises she couldn't explain, and a fear she couldn't name. He killed people in Mystic Falls with a casualness that suggested he had been doing it for so long that the weight of it no longer registered. He was cruel, specifically and deliberately, often to people who had given him no particular reason. He was also, on occasion, honest in ways that nobody else around Elena was willing to be. This was the first contradiction she noticed. Damon said things, true things, uncomfortable things, things that cut past the careful social fabric everyone else was maintaining, with an ease that was either the sign of someone who had no conscience or someone who had decided that performance was beneath them. She couldn't always tell which. She wasn't sure he could either. There was a night at the Salvatore boarding house, early enough in the school year, that she should still have been treating him purely as a threat. Stefan had been called away, some errand she had not been given the details of, and she had found herself alone with Damon in the space that she was still learning was his home as much as Stefan's. He had poured himself a drink. He had looked at her in that particular way he had, measuring and direct, and then He had said something that startled her by being entirely unguarded. He had told her that Stefan was better at being a person than he was. That Stefan had always been better at it, even before the vampirism. Even in 1864, when they had both been human boys from a good Virginia family with a future mapped out in advance. He had said it without self-pity and without the performance of bitterness, just as a simple fact he had long since made his peace with. She had not known what to do with that. She had not known what to do with any of the small moments that accumulated in those first weeks. The flash of something genuine before the mask came back down. The times he helped her without being asked, and then immediately said something cutting so that the help could be dismissed as incidental. She filed them away without examining them too closely. She was with Stefan. She was being careful. She was not the kind of person who found herself drawn to someone like Damon Salvatore. She kept telling herself this. The Miss Mystic Falls pageant arrived in late autumn, a founding family tradition that Delena had agreed to participate in before the year had become what it became. Stefan was supposed to be her escort. Stefan, increasingly unsteady on the edge of something Delena didn't yet fully understand, did not arrive. Damon did. He appeared at the door of the Lockwood estate in a dark suit with the ease of someone who had attended 100 events exactly like this one, which he had because he had been alive for 170 years and had worn a great many suits. He offered her his arm with a slight inclination of his head and said nothing about Stefan, and nothing about the fact that she was probably furious, and nothing about what it meant that he was the one standing there instead. He simply offered her his arm. She took it. They danced. It was not the simple thing it sounds like. It was a formal dance, choreographed, every step mapped out in advance, and Damon moved through it with the certainty of someone for whom 145 years of muscle memory made such things entirely effortless. Delena followed, and what struck her, what stayed with her in the quiet afterward, was that for those few minutes, nothing was performed. He wasn't being charming to manipulate her. She wasn't being composed to protect herself. They were simply two people moving together in a room full of people who were watching, and somehow the watching made no difference at all. She didn't write about it in her journal that night. Some things resist being made into words when you are not yet ready to know what they mean. Damon's reason for being in Mystic Falls remained Catherine, and remained urgent, and remained the source of everything destructive he did in those early months. The tomb beneath Fell's Church contained, or so everyone who had survived 1864 believed, the vampires who had been rounded up during the founding family's purge, sealed in with a grimoire's worth of Emily Bennett's magic. Damon believed Catherine was among them. Damon believed that getting her out was the only thing that mattered. Delena learned pieces of this history slowly, through Stefan's careful disclosures, through Bonnie's grandmother's reluctant assistance, through her own growing understanding of the town she had grown up in, without ever truly seeing. Mystic Falls had another history running beneath the one she'd been taught. Darker, older, written in the founding family's attempts to destroy what they didn't understand and preserve what served them. The council, the vampire hunters, the founding families themselves, her own family, the Gilberts, had been part of it. She was part of a legacy she'd never been told about, tied to a history she'd never been shown. living in a town that had always been more dangerous than it appeared. Through all of it, Damon moved at the edge of her awareness, threatening and useful and intermittently, unexpectedly kind. He saved her life twice in those months and immediately said something that made her want to be angry with him both times. He looked at her in rooms when he thought she wasn't paying attention. He told her truths about Stefan that Stefan hadn't found the words for yet. He was, despite everything, consistently present in a way that she could not account for purely through the logic of his own self-interest. She did not examine this too closely, not yet. What she did not know, and would not know for some time, was what had happened on the road the night her parents died. She did not know that the first honest thing anyone had said to her about love, that she deserved a love that consumed her, that she should not settle, had come from the man her boyfriend's family had spent months warning her about. She did not know that Damon Salvatore had looked at her in the fog, long before she had ever heard his name, and had seen something that made him tell her the truth before he thought to be careful about it. She did not know that he had taken the memory away because he was not yet the kind of person who could survive having meant something to someone. But the feeling had not entirely gone. It didn't work that way, it turned out. You could compel the memory from a person's mind, but something beneath the memory, the warmth of it, the weight of being seen, that had a way of lingering in a place that words couldn't reach. Elena Gilbert had spent the year feeling like she was reaching towards something she couldn't name, like there was an answer at the edge of her understanding that she kept almost finding. She thought it was grief. She thought it was Stefan. She thought it was a great many things that were easier to name than the truth. The wrong brother had arrived in Mystic Falls. The wrong brother had said the right thing in the dark and then taken it back. And Elena Gilbert, who prided herself on knowing her own mind, was already further from the story she'd told herself than she knew. There is a particular kind of attention that is different from attraction, though it is easy to confuse the two. Attraction is legible. It has a grammar, a set of recognizable signs, a vocabulary that people have been using since long before Elena Gilbert was born. But attention, the specific and involuntary kind, the kind that finds a person across a crowded room without being directed there, the kind that notices small things, a shift in posture, a change in expression, the precise moment when someone stops performing and forgets to put the mask back on. That kind of attention is harder to name and harder to dismiss. Elena noticed, sometime in October, that she was paying that kind of attention to Damon Salvatore. She did not do anything with the noticing. She filed it alongside the other things about Damon that didn't fit neatly into the category of threat, the small accumulating evidence that the man behind the cruelty was more complicated than the cruelty alone. She was with Stefan. She loved Stefan, or was building toward it, in the careful way you build toward love when you are 17 and grief hollowed and trying to find your footing in a world that has become stranger than you knew how to prepare for. She was not looking for complications. She was, in fact, actively avoiding them. Damon was not interested in being avoided. He had a way of inserting himself into situations with a breezy entitlement that would have been infuriating if it weren't occasionally so useful. He arrived at moments of crisis with the ease of someone who'd been monitoring the situation from a distance and had decided, on his own timeline, that now was the appropriate moment to intervene. He helped, and then he made the help difficult to accept gracefully. He gave with one hand and provoked with the other, so that you were never entirely sure whether to thank him or argue with him, and he seemed to find your uncertainty genuinely entertaining. Delena started to understand slowly that this was not random. The provocation was deliberate. It was distance management, a system he had developed consciously or otherwise to ensure that any moment of genuine connection was immediately surrounded by enough friction that it couldn't be examined too closely. He helped you and then insulted you so that you would be too busy being irritated to ask why he helped. He said something true and then said something cutting so that the true thing could be dismissed as incidental. He kept the exits clear at all times. She recognized it because she had done something similar herself in the months after the accident. Keep people close enough to function, far enough away to be safe. She had just been less obvious about it. The Salvatore history arrived in pieces, the way difficult histories always do. A detail here, a corrected assumption there, the gradual accumulation of information that changes the shape of everything you thought already understood. Delena had known, from the moment she learned Stefan was a vampire, that there was a story behind it. Vampires did not begin as vampires. There was always a human life that preceded the immortal one, and the human life left marks. What she learned about 1864 rearranged her understanding of both brothers. The Salvatore family had been prominent in Mystic Falls, a good Virginian name with land and standing and sons, who were expected to carry both forward into a prosperous future. Stefan and Damon had been those sons, different in temperament even then. Stefan more inward and principled, Damon more restless, more appetite, more likely to push against a life that had been arranged for him. They had both been human, they had both been young, and they had both fallen for the same woman, a guest in their father's house, a beautiful creature named Catherine Pierce, who had arrived like weather and rearranged everything she touched. What Catherine did to the Salvatore brothers in 1864 was not love, though she wore it convincingly enough that both of them believed it was. She fed from them. She compelled them. She played them against each other with the sophisticated cruelty of someone who had been doing it for centuries, who understood human desire well enough to keep both brothers devoted while giving neither of them enough to feel secure. She was not cruel because she hated them. She was cruel because she didn't think of them as people in quite the way they thought of themselves. They were interesting. They were beautiful. They were useful. When the founding families began their vampire purge, Catherine was captured. Both brothers tried to save her and failed. Both brothers were shot by their own father for the attempt, and both of them were turned by Catherine's blood in their systems when they died. They rose as vampires together in the same moment from the same cause, and then Damon learned that Stefan had been forced to get him to complete his transition, to feed him blood when Damon refused, because Stefan could not bear to watch his brother die again. It was not the beginning of their conflict, but it was the moment the conflict became permanent. Damon had believed for 145 years that Catherine was entombed beneath Fell's Church. He had built his entire immortal existence around that belief. The cruelty, the wandering, the refusal to form attachments, the performance of not caring as a philosophy of survival. All of it was underneath, a man waiting to recover what he had lost. All of it was grief wearing the costume of indifference. Elena understood this before she was ready to understand it. The way you can know something intellectually long before it settles into your body as truth. She understood that Damon's damage was not incidental to who he was. It was the organizing structure of everything he'd become. And she understood, quietly and uncomfortably, that the cruelty was not evidence of emptiness. It was evidence of the opposite. You did not weaponize your feelings unless you had feelings worth weaponizing. There was an evening at the boarding house in November, the kind of grey, wet November evening that Mystic Falls specialized in, where she had come looking for Stefan and found Damon instead. Stefan was out. She should have left. She stayed. He was in the study with a glass of bourbon and a record playing on the turntable. Something old, something that predated both of them. And he did not acknowledge her presence immediately, which he had come to understand was its own form of acknowledgement. He always knew she was there. The pretense of not noticing was another variety of the distance management. "He'll be back," Damon said, without looking up. "He's very responsible, very punctual. It's one of his best qualities." "I know," she said. "You could wait in the parlor. I'm fine here." He looked up then, and there was a moment, brief, quickly recovered, where his expression was simply curious. Not the performing curiosity he wore in public, not the pointed interest designed to unsettle. Just genuine, unguarded wondering about her. "You're not afraid of me anymore," he said. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." He looked back at his glass. "Most people are. In a room alone with me, they find reasons to leave." "Maybe I'm just stubborn," she said. "Maybe," he agreed, and there was something in his voice that she didn't entirely have a word for. Something that might have been appreciation if she hadn't already decided she was reading too much into him. She sat down across the room from him, not close, maintaining the geometry of safety, and asked him something she had been thinking about for several weeks. She asked him what Catherine was actually like. Not the facts of her. She knew the facts by then, or enough of them. But what she had been like as a person in 1864 to a 20-something human man who had no defenses against her. Damon was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "She made you feel like the only person in any room, like whatever you wanted was not only reasonable but inevitable, like the world was arranged in your favor and she was the proof of it." He turned the glass slowly in his hands. "It's a particular skill, making someone feel chosen. Is that what she did to you?" "For a while," he said, "until I understood that she did it to everyone." The record played. Outside the windows, rain moved through the old oaks. "I'm sorry," Elena said, "for what she did to you, to both of you." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something that was not quite dismissal and not quite openness, and sat in an uncomfortable place between the two. Then he said, "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Feel sorry for me. It makes it harder to be appropriately terrible." And the mask came back down, and he smiled the smile he used when he wanted to end a conversation without appearing to end it, and the moment closed like a door. But it had happened, and she knew what she had seen. Bonnie Bennett did not trust Damon, and said so clearly, with the directness that was Bonnie's particular gift, an occasional inconvenience. Bonnie's grandmother had told her things about the Salvatores, about the history of vampires in Mystic Falls, about the cost of the 1864 purge to the Bennett line. Bonnie's magic was entangled with that history in ways that made Damon specifically not a person she was willing to extend the benefit of the doubt to. Her distrust was not irrational. It was, in fact, well documented. Caroline's history with Damon was worse, though Caroline herself carried it in the particular way that compulsion victims carry what was done to them, with gaps in the memory, with a residue of feeling that didn't attach to specific incidents, with a fear that couldn't entirely name its own source. Delena knew enough to understand what had happened. She did not look away from it. She held Damon accountable for it in her own mind, in the column she kept of things that were simply true about him and could not be excused or softened. She had learned by then that holding two things simultaneously was the only honest approach to Damon Salvatore. He had done genuine harm to people she loved. He had also done genuine good to people he owed nothing to. Both were true. The impulse to resolve the contradiction by choosing one and discarding the other was understandable, and she resisted it because she suspected the contradiction was not a sign that she was missing something, but rather that she was seeing something whole. Stefan warned her, gently and without ultimatums, because Stefan was not the kind of person who gave ultimatums. He said that Damon's moments of goodness were real, but that they were not reliable, that Damon had a history of investing in something until it became inconvenient, and then turning his back on it without apparent difficulty, that she should not mistake his current interest in her well-being for something that would hold under pressure. She listened to Stefan with the care she gave everything he said, and she thought about the rain and the bourbon and the record, and the way Damon had said "don't do that" when she expressed sympathy, and the particular texture of a man who deflects compassion because he doesn't know what to do with it. She thought that Damon Salvatore was not a person who turned his back on things easily. She thought the indifference was the performance, and the caring was the thing underneath it he was trying to protect. She did not say this to Stefan. December arrived, and the tomb became urgent. The grimoire, the ritual, the growing desperation in Damon's movements through all of it. She could see the shape of what this meant to him, even when he was performing nonchalance. He wanted Catherine out of that tomb. Everything in his life for over a century had pointed toward this moment, and he was moving through the preparations with a focus that, if she had seen it applied to anything else, she might have described as devotion. She watched him and thought about what it cost a person to love someone who could not love them back. She thought about 145 years of carrying something that heavy, about what it had done to the shape of him, about whether there was a version of Damon Salvatore that had never been betrayed. She thought that version might have been someone worth knowing in a completely uncomplicated way. There was a moment in mid-December, just before everything moved toward the tomb, when she came across him alone in the square. It was late, the kind of late that was almost early, and he was standing in the town square looking at nothing in particular with an expression she had learned to recognize as the one he wore when he forgot anyone was watching. She almost didn't stop. She almost let him have the privacy of not being observed. "It's late," she said, because she could not. He turned and the expression changed, reassembled into something more managed. Elena Gilbert, he said, wandering around alone at night. A habit of yours, I'm starting to think. Couldn't sleep. Neither could I, though my reasons are probably more existential than yours. She stood beside him in the cold and looked at what he'd been looking at, which was the old clock tower, which was nothing, which was just the town he had grown up in and left and returned to, and would always be returning to in some sense that she was only beginning to understand. Are you afraid? She asked. About the tomb? About what you'll find? He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, I'm afraid of a lot of things, Elena. I just don't make a habit of advertising them. She nodded. She believed him. She believed him more than she believed almost anything else he'd said to her, because it arrived without the fencing, without the preparation, without any of the apparatus he usually deployed to keep people at a safe and manageable distance. She went home. She wrote in her journal. She wrote that she thought Damon was one of the loneliest people she had ever met, and then she crossed it out, and then she wrote it again, because it was true. And she had long since decided that the truth about Damon Salvatore, all of it, the ugly parts and the unexpected parts and the parts that didn't fit any simple story, was worth looking at directly, even when looking directly was uncomfortable, even when it complicated everything she thought she understood about what she wanted and who she was choosing and why. She was not, she told herself, falling for him. She was simply paying attention. She was simply, for the first time, being honest about what she saw. The tomb opened on a night in winter, and Catherine Pierce was not inside it. This is the fact around which everything else in Damon Salvatore's existence had been arranged for 145 years, and its absence, the absence of Catherine, the absence of the thing he'd been moving towards since 1864, arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a stillness, a stopping, the kind of silence that follows when an engine that has been running continuously for longer than most things live suddenly cuts out, and you realize only in the quiet that you had stopped hearing it years ago. Bonnie's grandmother had performed the ritual. The tomb had opened. The vampires sealed inside since 1864 had emerged, disoriented and ancient and ravenous, and among them, not present, not waiting, not reaching for him through the dark, was Catherine. She had never been there. She had escaped in 1864 and had not looked back and had not sent word and had not, in 145 years, made any effort whatsoever to find the man who had spent every one of those years believing she was entombed and waiting to be saved. She had simply left and lived and not thought of him or thought of him and found a thought insufficient reason to return. 145 years. The arithmetic of it was almost impossible to hold. 145 years of building an existence around a single purpose, of using cruelty as armor and indifference as infrastructure, of choosing not to form attachments because attachments were a distraction from the only thing that mattered. He had killed and wandered and refused to feel because feeling was a luxury reserved for after, for when Catherine was free and he had kept his promise to the boy he had been in 1864 who had loved her without reservation or strategy, and she had never been there. Elena watched him in the aftermath and understood something about grief that she had not fully understood before. She had known her own grief intimately, the grief of losing her parents, of losing the life she had expected to live. But that grief had a shape to it, a logic. Something precious had existed and then been taken. Damon's grief was architecturally different. It was the grief of discovering that the thing you had been mourning had never existed in the form you mourned it, that the love you had been loyal to had not been loyal back, had perhaps never been the thing you believed it was, that 145 years of devotion had been tendered to someone who found it, at best, convenient. She did not say anything to him immediately. There were no words that arrived which seemed adequate to the scale of it, and she had learned by then that offering Damon inadequate words was worse than offering him silence. He did not need comfort performed at him. He needed, if any, to be seen without the performance of needing to be seen. So she stayed near him in the way she had learned to stay near him. Not intrusively, not at a distance that suggested she was afraid of what she might find, but present, steady, there. He held himself together with the discipline of a man who had been holding himself together in public for over a century. His face was composed. His movements were measured. He poured drinks and said things and maintained every visible surface of the life he had constructed. But she was watching him closely enough by then to see the places where the composition was effortful rather than natural, to see the slight rigidity at the jaw, the way his eyes occasionally focused on nothing in the particular way of someone who is not seeing the room they are standing in. He was somewhere in 1864. He was somewhere on the road between that year and this one, trying to locate himself in a map that had just lost its only landmark. The night after the tomb opened, he came to her window. She heard him before she saw him. Not the sound of his arrival, because Damon moved without sound when he chose to, but some prior awareness, the particular quality of attention that his presence generated in her, even at a distance. She was in bed, but not asleep. She had been lying in the dark thinking about him, which she was not yet fully admitting to herself. And then she heard the quiet contact of his presence at her window and sat up. He was outside on the porch roof, which was something he did with the casual presumption of someone who had long since decided that her space was also his space when the situation warranted it. She should have found this more objectionable than she did. She went to the window and opened it, and the cold came in with him, and he stood in her room in his dark coat with his face doing the particular thing it did when he was not performing anything, when he had simply run out of the energy required for performance. She was never there, he said. It was not an announcement. It was something he was saying aloud to hear how it sounded, to see if the words made it more or less real than it had been in the silence of his own mind. I know, Elena said. 145 years. He said it the way you say a number, when you are trying to make it feel like what it actually represents, and finding that numbers are inadequate instruments for that purpose. I spent 145 years. He stopped. He looked at the floor of her bedroom, at nothing, and when he looked up, there was something in his face that she had not seen there before, something undefended. I don't know why I am without that. She understood what he meant. Not Catherine specifically, not the love specifically, but the purpose, the organizing principle, the thing that had given his existence a direction when everything else was just the maintenance of an immortal life. He had been pointed at something for so long that he did not know how to stand without pointing. She crossed the room. She sat beside him on the edge of her bed, not quite touching, close enough that the closeness was itself a statement of something. She did not offer him platitudes. She did not tell him it would be all right, or that Catherine wasn't worth it, or that he would find another reason to exist. She simply sat with him in the wreckage of the thing he had built his life around, and let the wreckage be what it was. He looked at her for a long moment with that undefended expression, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that would have been better than the quiet. Then he said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Honestly?" A pause. "Nothing. I didn't expect anything. You were Catherine's face and Stefan's girl, and a complication I didn't have time for." He looked away. "And then you kept not being those things." She didn't answer. She waited. "I love you," he said. He said it the way someone says a true thing they have been carrying for long enough that saying it is less a choice than a release. The way a door opens when the pressure behind it finally exceeds the lock. It arrived without preamble and without the apparatus of strategy, without any of the careful construction he normally brought to words that mattered. It was simply there, in the room with them, undeniable and sudden and absolutely real. He looked at her with eyes that were, for once, entirely open. No irony, no fencing, no managed distance. Just Damon Salvatore, the human boy who had become a monster and spent a century and a half pretending that was sufficient, telling the truth in the dark to the one person in his long existence who had looked at him directly without looking away. "You are my life," he said. "The thing I didn't know I was waiting for, because I was so convinced I was waiting for something else. And I know that this is..." He stopped. "I know what it is. I know what it complicates. I know every reason it can't be what it is." Another pause, something moving through his expression that she didn't entirely have a word for. "But I love you, Elena." I needed to say it once where someone could hear it. The room was very quiet. Outside, Mystic Falls was dark and winter cold, and entirely unconcerned with what was happening in this small upstairs bedroom. Her heartbeat was loud in her own ears. She was looking at him with the full attention she had been giving him for months, and for the first time, there was nothing to file away, no contradiction to hold simultaneously, no gap between what he was showing her and what she suspected was underneath. It was simply him, the whole of him, offered without defense. She did not say anything. She did not have the chance. His hand came up and he touched her face gently, with a tenderness that was almost painful to witness from someone who had convinced the world he was not capable of it. And then he kissed her, softly, briefly, a kiss that was not a taking, but a giving. And then he pulled back and looked at her with something that might have been the most honest expression she'd ever seen on any human or inhuman face. And then his eyes changed. She saw it happen. The shift in his gaze, the deliberate quality that came into it, the focus that was not quite the focus of connection. She felt the compulsion settle over her like a warm and unwanted weight, felt the present moment begin to soften at its edges, felt herself being gently guided away from what had just happened. "Forget this," he said, or something like it. "Go to sleep. You're tired. This didn't happen." And then she was lying in her bed, and the window was closed, and the room was empty, and the night outside was just a night. She slept without knowing what she had forgotten. She woke in the morning and felt, inexplicably, like something had passed through her that she couldn't account for. A warmth without a source, a quality of having been seen that had no attached memory, an echo of something real moving through a space where the real thing no longer was. She thought perhaps she had dreamed something. She could not remember what. Damon drove back to the boarding house through the dark streets of Mystic Falls and sat in the study with the lights off and did not pour a drink. He sat in the particular stillness of someone who has just done the bravest thing of their life and then immediately destroyed the evidence of it. And he understood, with the clarity that arrives too late, what the act of erasing it revealed about him. He had meant every word. That was not the problem. The problem was that he had meant every word, and the meaning of it had terrified him so completely that he had reached for the only tool available to him: the compulsion, the taking back, the enforced forgetting. Because being truly known by someone was more frightening than anything else his long existence had placed in front of him. He had looked into genuine feeling and flinched. He had told the truth and then unmade it, not because it wasn't real, but because it was. He had spent 145 years in service of a love that had not loved him back. And when something real had arrived, unexpected, unearned, impossible to have planned for, he had compelled it out of the room. Because Damon Salvatore did not yet know how to be the person who stayed in a moment like that. He had not practiced it. He had spent too long in the architecture of loss, in the comfortable grammar of wanting something he could not have. The wanting was familiar, the having was not. And in the gap between those two things, he had done what he always did. He had protected himself from the possibility of losing it by ensuring, preemptively, that it could not fully exist. Delena went through the following days without the memory, but not entirely without the feeling. Something had shifted in the atmosphere between them. Some quality of the air in rooms where they both stood. She noticed that she was less guarded around him than she had been. She noticed that he was, for a brief and passing period, quieter than usual, less provoking, less armored, moving through the aftermath of the tomb and Catherine's absence with a subdued quality that she attributed to grief. She was not wrong that it was grief. She simply did not know its full shape. He had lost Catherine for the second time. First to the truth of her indifference, then to his own confession, and then to the compulsion that had made sure the confession couldn't change anything. He had found a way to be devastated by love twice in the same winter, which was, even for Damon Salvatore, a considerable achievement in the direction of self-destruction. But the feeling did not disappear entirely from Elena. That was the thing about compelling a memory. You could lift the specific moment from a person's conscious recall, could smooth the surface of their knowing, so that they could not reach what had happened. But you could not reach the part of a person that simply knew, without knowing why, that they were standing near something real. You could not compel the warmth out of the spaces where warmth had been. Lena did not know what Damon had said to her in her bedroom on a cold winter night. She did not know that the most honest moment in his immortal existence had taken place in her presence and been taken back before she could respond to it. But she felt it, the shape of it, the shadow it left in the place where the memory should have been, and she filed it away with all the other things about Damon Salvatore that she could not entirely explain, and she kept paying attention, and she kept being the person who did not look away. She did not know yet that this would be enough, that looking steadily and without flinching at the full truth of someone, even when they were trying their hardest to prevent it, was its own form of love, that she was already further into this than she understood. The night he said it first was the night she forgot it, but the saying of it had happened. It had been real, and real things Eleanor Gilbert was beginning to learn had a way of refusing to stay buried. Catherine Pierce returned to Mystic Falls in September, and she did it the way she did everything, without announcement, without apology, and with a specific kind of devastation that only someone who understands a place completely can inflict upon it. She walked back into the lives of the Salvatore brothers wearing Elena's face, and the horror of it was not simply the deception. The horror was the precision of it. Catherine knew exactly what she was doing when she kissed Damon in the hallway of the Salvatore boarding house. Exactly what she was testing. Exactly what information she was gathering from the way he responded before he understood who she was. She had always been a scientist of desire, cataloguing reactions with the detachment of someone for whom other people's feelings were primarily data. Damon kissed her back. For a moment, one terrible suspended moment, he kissed her back, and then he knew. The knowing arrived not through any single thing, but through the accumulation of small wrongnesses. The angle of it, the quality of her attention, the way Catherine wore desire like a costume rather than feeling it from the inside. He had kissed Elena enough times in his imagination to know, in his body, the difference. He pulled back. He looked at her. And Catherine smiled at him with Elena's mouth, and Damon understood, in the cold clarity of that moment, two things simultaneously. The first was that Catherine had come back to destabilize them. All of them. The Salvatores, the town, whatever fragile arrangements had been made in the months since the tomb. The second was that he had known, in the instant before he understood it was Catherine, that he wanted it to be Elena, not as a secondary preference, as the only preference, as the thing his body recognized before his mind caught up. He did not examine this too closely. He did not have the equipment for it yet. The willingness to sit with what it meant, to follow the thread of it back through the months to a winter bedroom and a confession he had erased. Instead, he did what Damon Salvatore did, with information that was too large to process cleanly. He put it somewhere interior and inaccessible and moved on. Catherine's return reshaped the landscape of Mystic Falls with the efficiency of someone who had been reshaping landscapes for 5 centuries. She killed Aunt Jenna's boyfriend. She turned Matt, briefly, and then not. She played Stefan with a manipulation so refined it was almost admirable, reactivating the old devotion he had carried for her in 1864, peeling back the layers of the man he had become to find the boy who had loved her without defense. She was not doing this because she loved Stefan. She was doing it because Stefan in pain was useful, and because she wanted what was underneath Mystic Falls, the Moonstone, the vampire werewolf curse, something old and powerful that the town had been sitting on for generations. Eleanor watched Catherine operate and felt something she was not accustomed to feeling, a cold, clear anger that was not performed and not managed. Catherine wore her face. Catherine moved through Elena's life with Elena's face and used it to hurt people Eleanor loved. And the intimacy of that violation was unlike anything Eleanor had encountered before. It was the particular cruelty of the doppelganger mythology made personal. The existence of Catherine suggested that Delena was, in some cosmic sense, a copy, an echo, a lesser iteration of something that had come before. She refused this. Quietly, privately, with a stubbornness that was one of her least advertised qualities, she refused it. Damon had been humiliated by the kiss, and humiliation in Damon expressed itself as anger, because anger was more manageable than the thing beneath it. He was furious at Catherine in the specific way you are furious at someone who has found the precise location of something you were trying to protect and pressed on it deliberately. He was furious at himself for the moment of wanting, for the split second before recognition, when he had simply been present in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. And he was furious at Delena, obliquely and irrationally, for being the person whose face Catherine had used, for being the reason the wanting had a name. He did not say any of this to Delena. Instead, he was sharp and restless in ways she had learned to read as something happening underneath the surface, some pressure finding the cracks. She let him be sharp. She did not take it personally, or rather, she took it personally and set it aside, which was a distinction that mattered. The curse unfolded around them, with the insistence of plot that has been building for centuries. The moonstone and the sun and moon curse. The doppelganger blood required to break it. The werewolf side of the equation arriving through Tyler Lockwood's first transformation. A terrible night, howling and grinding, and the particular violence of a body doing something a body was never meant to do. Delena had been there for pieces of it, had seen enough to understand the scale of what was being asked of the people around her, the cost that transformation extracted. Tyler survived. Mason Lockwood, his uncle, did not, which sat in the atmosphere of the town like a weight nobody fully addressed. Damon killed Mason. He did it without particular drama or regret, with the pragmatic efficiency of someone removing an obstacle. Delena heard about it afterward and felt the familiar doubling, the acknowledgement that he had done something with genuine moral cost, alongside the acknowledgement that he had done it, at least partly, in service of protecting her. Both things true, neither thing sufficient to cancel the other. She was getting very good at holding both things. The werewolf bite happened on a night in October that Delena would not forget for reasons that had nothing to do with the bite itself. There had been a conflict, complicated and multi-sided in the way that Mystic Falls conflicts always were, involving the originals and Catherine's machinations and a plan that had not held together the way it was supposed to. In the chaos of it, a werewolf had bitten Damon. He didn't tell her immediately. This was characteristic. Damon had a relationship with his own vulnerability that involved keeping it as invisible as possible for as long as possible, which was ironic given how clearly visible it was to anyone paying attention. He downplayed it. He was sardonic about it. He made it seem like a manageable inconvenience. She found out the truth of what a werewolf bite meant for a vampire. That it was fatal, that there was no cure, that it would progress through fever and hallucination into death with the patient certainty of a disease that had never lost. And she found it out at approximately the same moment she found out that he had placed himself in the position to be bitten not by accident, but by choice. He had been between her and the werewolf. He had been there, and then he had been bitten, and the sequence was not coincidence. She went to him. He was at the boarding house, already feverish, already beginning the progression that a werewolf bite inflicted on vampire biology. The venom worked through the system in stages. The fever first, then the confusion, then the hallucinations that blurred the line between memory and present until the victim could no longer reliably tell them apart. She had read enough, learned enough to know what was coming, and she sat beside him through the early hours of it with the stubbornness of someone who has decided that presence is the only thing they have to offer, and they are going to offer it fully. He moved in and out of clarity. When he was clear, he was wry about it, making the kinds of observations that were designed to demonstrate that he was not frightened, even though the effort of demonstrating it confirmed that he was. When the clarity slipped, he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere in the past, sometimes in 1864, sometimes in decades between then and now. He said Catherine's name once, which she expected. He said her name twice, which she did not. Not Catherine's name, her name. Delena. He said it the way you say the name of someone who is already inside the room of your most private thinking, without the signaling that precedes deliberate speech, without the framing that turns a name into a communication. He said it as though she was simply where his mind went when it was not performing anything, when all the careful architecture of his usual presentation had dissolved in fever and left only what was underneath. She held his hand. She was not sure he knew she was there. She held it anyway. There was one moment of terrible lucidity in which he looked at her with entirely clear eyes, the fever breaking. For just a moment, a window in the delirium, and she saw in his expression something that was worse than confusion. It was recognition, complete, unguarded recognition of her as the specific person she was to him, not as an abstraction or a comfort or a face that resembled someone else, just her. "You should go," he said. "I'm not going," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then the window closed and the fever took him back, and she stayed until morning and did not go. Stefan obtained the cure, Klaus's blood, because Klaus, as the original hybrid, carried the only antidote, obtained at a cost that Delena did not fully learn the details of until later. The bite receded. Damon recovered with the physical efficiency of vampire biology, the fever breaking and the hallucinations retreating, and his body resetting to its usual marble steadiness within hours of the cure being administered. He did not thank her for staying. She did not expect him to, and not because she had given up on the possibility of his gratitude, but because she understood by then that his gratitude was expressed sideways, through action rather than acknowledgement, through the way he positioned himself in her orbit differently in the days after, closer, quieter, less provocative, as though some internal adjustments had been made that he had not yet found the language for. She had been honest with herself in the hours beside his sick bed. She had been honest in the way you can only be honest when the situation has stripped away the available justifications and left you with just the truth of your own feeling. She was not simply concerned for Damon the way she was concerned for anyone she knew. She was not simply grateful to him for protecting her. What she felt when she sat beside him in the fever, when she held his hand and said his name and waited for the clarity to return to his eyes, that was specific to him. It had his shape. It could not be transferred to anyone else or explained by anything other than what it actually was. She sat with this knowledge for several days and did not know what to do with it. She was with Stefan. She loved Stefan, she believed. She believed it with the sincerity of someone who had built something real with another person and did not want to dismiss what had been built. Stefan had been her way back to herself after the accident, her first evidence that life would have color again. That was not nothing. That was not the kind of thing you looked at clearly and found to be empty. But there was Damon, and there was what she felt when she was near him, what she felt when he was in danger, what she felt when he said her name in the fever without knowing she was listening. And there was this specific honesty of caring about someone, not because they make you feel safe, but because they make you feel seen. Because their specific wrongness and rightness and damage and grace has become, without your permission, necessary to you. Elena Gilbert did not have a clean way through this. She did not have a version of herself available that could want what she wanted without it meaning something complicated about everything else. She was not the kind of person who could hold both things and call it acceptable. She was too honest for compartments, too self-aware for sustainable self-deception. She was also, it turned out, not yet brave enough to say any of it aloud. Catherine continued her campaign through Mystic Falls with the patience of someone who had been playing long games since before the town existed in its current form. She smiled at Elena with Elena's face, and Elena understood, in those encounters, what she was being shown. Catherine was what happened when a person spent 5 centuries prioritizing their own survival above every other consideration. She was what you became when you stopped letting things matter. She was, in the specific and uncomfortable way of all mirrors, a warning. Eleanor looked at Catherine and thought about what it would mean to be the person who chose safety over feeling, who decided that the complexity was too much, that the easier path was the right one, that love which required nothing of you was preferable to love that required everything. She looked at Catherine and thought, not that, whatever else, not that. The space between her and Damon in those autumn months was charged in the way of things that are accumulating without being named. They were sharper with each other than was strictly necessary. They argued about small things that were not actually about the small things. They stood too close in rooms where there was plenty of space, and then both pretended not to notice. She had feelings for Damon Salvatore. They were not peripheral. They were not going away. They were specific and persistent, and they had been growing in the dark of her without her permission for long enough that denying them had become an act of ongoing effort rather than natural truth. She did not yet say this to anyone. She did not yet say it to herself with the full declarative weight it deserved. But she knew it the way you know things that you are not ready to know. The way a fact can be true in your body before it has been ratified by your conscious mind. Catherine had come back to use them all. She was using them efficiently and without remorse, in service of her own survival and her own agenda. But in the wreckage of Catherine's return, something else was also happening. Something quieter and more irreversible than any curse or moonstone or ancient doppelganger mythology. Elena was learning what she wanted, and what she wanted had Damon's face, and Damon's voice saying her name in the dark, and the specific and irreplaceable quality of being known by someone who had not expected to know you. She was not ready to say it yet, but she was getting there. The distance was closing, in the slow and certain way of things that were always going to happen. They had been heading toward each other since the fog on Route 1, and the words he had said, and then taken back. They were getting there, both of them, from from opposite directions, with different fears, at their own reluctant pace. They were getting there. The thing about inevitability is that it does not feel inevitable while you are living inside it. It feels like a series of choices, each one contingent, each one capable of going differently if something small had been otherwise. It is only afterward, standing outside the sequence and looking back at its shape, that you see how it was always moving in one direction, how every detour and delay was simply the long way toward the same destination. Delena's death had been planned around her for months before she fully understood the architecture of it. The sun and moon curse required a doppelganger. Her blood specifically, her death specifically, the sacrifice of the last living shadow of Katerina Petrova on the night of the full moon. Klaus, the original hybrid, had been moving toward this moment across centuries, and now that he had located his doppelganger in a small Virginia town, the momentum of 500 years of planning had become simply a matter of logistics. She was going to die. This was not a possibility being guarded against. It was a scheduled event that the people around her were scrambling to delay or divert, and Eleanor understood the distinction and found it, in her more honest moments, almost clarifying. When the worst thing is not a fear but a fact, a certain kind of anxiety becomes unavailable to you. What remains is something quieter and more purposeful. The question not of whether, but of how to live the time that remains. She thought about Damon more than she thought she should. This was the winter of Rose. Rose was an old vampire, a runner, a woman who had survived centuries by being practical about survival, and who had arrived in Mystic Falls trailing information about the originals that proved both useful and terrible. Rose was dying by February, a werewolf bite, the same sentence that had nearly taken Damon months before, and this time without the reprieve of Klaus's blood, without any available cure, without any outcome other than the one that was coming. Damon sat with her at the end. Elena knew this because she had been there for part of it, and because Damon, who did not typically offer anyone access to his most private act of tenderness, had not hidden this one from her. He had gone into Rose's dream, into the specific and painful mercy of giving a dying person a beautiful place to die in, and had guided her out of the fever and the darkness and into a field in England that she had loved as a human girl. Sunlight and grass and everything that vampirism had taken from her returned in the final minutes. Elena stood in the doorway of the room after it was over and watched Damon sitting beside the body of a woman he had known for only weeks and had chosen anyway to grieve properly. He did not perform the grief. He did not perform the absence of it. He simply sat, and the sitting was its own form of testimony. To Rose, and to the part of himself he had decided not to keep buried. She did not say anything. She crossed the room and sat beside him, and he looked at her with an expression that did not ask her to pretend she hadn't seen it, that did not reach for the usual deflection. She was frightened, he said, at the end, before I went in. I know. I made it. I tried to make it not frightening. You did, Elena said. I could see that you did. He looked away, and she watched the working of something in his jaw, the deliberate effort of keeping the grief at an appropriate pressure, not releasing it entirely, but not sealing it off, finding the narrow passage between the two. She reached over and put her hand over his, and he looked down at their hands with the expression of someone encountering something they had not prepared for. He did not move away. He did not make a joke. He simply allowed it, which from Damon was his own form of extraordinary. They sat like that for a while, in the room where Rose had died, and something between them settled into a new and permanent configuration. The sacrifice approached through March with the inexorability of weather. Plans were made and revised and partially destroyed by Catherine's interference, by the original's involvement, by the sheer complexity of a ritual that required multiple supernatural elements aligning simultaneously. Elijah entered the picture, an original with his own agenda and his own code, a man who kept his promises in the way of someone for whom a promise was a load-bearing structure. He made Elena a deal. He would help them. Klaus would die in the aftermath. Elena would survive. She believed him, partially. She believed him enough to agree, which was not quite the same thing. Damon did not believe him at all. Damon's position on Elena's survival was not strategic and not diplomatic and not interested in the nuance of Elijah's code of honor. Damon's position was that Elena would not die, that no ritual, no ancient curse, no 500-year-old hybrid schedule would be permitted to take her life, and that anyone who accepted Elena's death as an acceptable component of any plan was not someone he was interested in cooperating with. He said this with a directness that was not quite anger. It was past anger. In the place past anger, that is something more like bedrock, like a fact about the world that he was simply reporting. Stefan thought the plan with Elijah was the best available option. Elena agreed with Stefan. Damon disagreed with everyone and was overruled, and the disagreement sat in the household of those weeks like a piece of furniture nobody wanted to acknowledge. It was in this atmosphere, the planning and the disagreement and the approaching deadline of the sacrifice, that Damon said it again. Not in the same way as the winter bedroom, not with the fever break honesty of someone who has run out of performance. This time, it was deliberate. This time, he knew exactly what he was doing, knew that she was going to her death in the morning, and that there was something he needed her to know before she went, not for his sake, but for the truth of it, because the truth deserved to exist in the world even if there was no guarantee she would come back to do anything with it. He came to her room. She was sitting on the bed in the way of someone who is trying not to let the waiting feel like waiting, trying to be present in the hours remaining rather than reaching anxiously toward what came next. He came in without knocking, which was characteristic. He stood across the room from her for a moment, looking at her with an expression she had learned by then to read with some accuracy, the specific combination of intention and difficulty that preceded him saying something he had not permitted himself to say before. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. "Okay," she said. "I just need you to know something before tomorrow." He moved to the edge of her bed and sat, not close, the geometry of his usual careful distance. "I love you, Elena." He said it without the apparatus that had surrounded the first saying of it, without the fever and the dark and the unguarded collapse that had preceded the compulsion. Sober, present, knowing what he was doing. "I need you to know that, not because I expect anything from it, not because I think it changes what happens tomorrow, just because it's true and you're going to go face something terrible, and you should know that there is at least one person in this world who thinks you are the most important thing in it." She looked at him. The room was very quiet. She was aware of her own heartbeat, of the particular quality of the silence between them, of the years and the almost moments, and the things said and taken back that had led to this specific sentence in this specific room. "Damon," she started. "It's a problem," he said, before she could finish, not cutting her off, completing the thought she was moving toward, knowing her well enough to know where she was going. "I know. You don't have to say it. I know what I am to you and what Stefan is, and I'm not asking you to sort anything out tonight. I just..." He stopped. He looked at her with those open eyes, the ones she only saw when the performance had been voluntarily set aside. I needed to say it once where it could stay said. She understood what he meant. She heard what was underneath it. The echo of a night in winter she could not remember but had never entirely stopped feeling the shape of. She heard the deliberateness of this, the choice not to take it back this time, the willingness to let the truth be true regardless of what it cost him. "'Tis a problem," she said softly. "What I feel, it's a problem, 'cause I don't know what to do with it. And I'm going somewhere tomorrow where I might not come back from. And I don't think I should say anything tonight that I'm not sure I can." "You don't have to," he said. "You don't have to say anything." He reached out and pushed her hair back from her face, gently, with a care that was almost painful to be on the receiving end of. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. She did not pull away. She turned her face slightly into his hand in a movement that was not decided but simply happened, that came from somewhere underneath the decision-making faculty. He looked at her. She looked at him. They almost hung in the air between them, shimmering and real and not completed, because she was going to her death in the morning, and he had said what he needed to say, and she was not yet the person who could say back what she felt without being sure she would survive to stand behind it. "Come back," he said. It was barely above a whisper, not a demand, a request, the most unguarded request he had ever made of anyone. "I'll try," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment, then stood, then walked to the door. He paused in the doorway, with his back to her. "For what it's worth," he said, without turning around, "I think you're going to be remarkable. Whatever happens tomorrow, you always are." And then he was gone, and she was alone in her room, with the weight of what had just happened, with the feeling that was not small and not peripheral, and had his name written all over it. The sacrifice happened at the Lockwood estate on a full moon night in May. The details of it assembled themselves with the horrible efficiency of something that had been organized for centuries. The werewolf, the vampire, the doppelganger, the moonstone. Klaus moved through the ritual with the detached precision of someone performing a long-anticipated procedure. Elena was there and present and trying to be brave, which she was, which she had always been better at than she gave herself credit for. John Gilbert died. Jenna Summers died, turned mid-ritual, sacrificed as the vampire component in a cruelty so specific and so targeted that it took Elena's breath away in the aftermath. She had not known Jenna would be part of it. She had not known, and she had not been able to prevent it, and the weight of that would live in her for a very long time. And Elena died. Klaus drained her on the ground of the ritual site, and her heart stopped, and the doppelganger line of Katerina Petrova ended in the grass of Mystic Falls, while the moon watched without comment. Elijah was there in the aftermath, as promised. The plan moved toward Klaus's destruction, and then it didn't, because Elijah had his own reasons, older than any of their arrangements, and he made a different choice at the last possible moment. Klaus survived. Elijah took him and ran, and the plan that had been built around Eleanor's survival beyond the sacrifice collapsed into something messier and more uncertain. But Eleanor came back, not through any plan or cure or magical preparation. She came back because Bonnie had worked a spell. Because John had made a sacrifice she only learned the details of later, giving his life force to anchor her return. She woke on the grass of the ritual site, and she was alive, and she was Eleanor, and the world was still the world. Damon was not there when she woke. He had not been part of the ritual site team. His role had been elsewhere, managing other threats in the moving disaster of that night. He learned she had survived through Stefan, through a phone call, through the words she's alive relayed in someone else's voice. She was told later what he had done when he heard. She was told by someone who had witnessed it and who said it with the careful neutrality of someone reporting something they had not expected to see. He had sat down, just sat, in the middle of whatever controlled chaos had been occupying him, and put his face in his hands for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something. And then he had stood up and continued being Damon Salvatore, functional and sardonic, and moving efficiently through the remaining problems of the night. She held that image and turned it over for a long time after. He came to see her the next day, and he did not mention what he had said the night before the sacrifice. He did not ask her what she had felt when he said it, did not revisit the almost, did not press for anything she hadn't offered. He simply came and sat with her in the way of someone for whom presence was his own form of speech, and they talked about everything except what mattered most. And that was all right. It was all right because she understood now that he had told the truth, that it had stayed said this time, that he had not reached for the compulsion, had not taken it back or smoothed it over or found a way to make it not have happened. It existed between them, acknowledged and unresolved, the way real things exist, not neatly, not conveniently, but permanently. She was alive. He had said he loved her and had not unmade it. And the space between those two facts was not empty. It was full of something she was still learning the name of, something that had been growing since a night on a road she could not remember and had not stopped growing since. She did not know yet what she was going to do with it. She only knew she was going to have to do something. Because Damon Salvatore had told her the truth twice now, and she had survived both times, and the surviving changed the available excuses considerably. Summer arrived in Mystic Falls the way it always did, indifferent to what the town had just been through, laying heat over the grief and the wreckage with the impartiality of a season that does not distinguish between ordinary years and catastrophic ones. The flowers came up. The days lengthened. People who had survived the spring moved through June with the careful tentativeness of people who were not entirely sure the worst was finished. Stefan was gone. This was the central fact of that summer, the absence around which everything else arranged itself. Stefan had made a deal with Klaus, his freedom and his cooperation in exchange for Klaus's blood, the cure for the werewolf bite that had been killing Damon. He had saved Damon's life at the cost of his own liberty, and then he had left with Klaus without explanation and without goodbye, becoming something Eleanor did not yet have the full picture of, something she would spend the next several months trying to find. She thought about this often in those early weeks. The specific shape of what Stefan had done. He had traded himself for Damon. He had looked at the available options and had chosen the one that kept his brother alive, regardless of what it meant for himself. There was something in that choice that Delena held carefully, that she did not examine too closely, because examining it too closely led to questions she wasn't ready to answer about what it meant that Damon's life had been worth that price. That Stefan, who knew his brother better than anyone, had decided without apparent hesitation that it was worth that price. Damon stayed. This was not nothing. In the geography of everything that summer rearranged, Damon choosing to stay in Mystic Falls rather than pursue his brother immediately, rather than disappear into the nomadic existence that would have been available to him, was a fact with weight. He stayed because Delena needed someone to stay. He stayed because Jeremy was in crisis, and Bonnie was grieving, and Mystic Falls required someone willing to do the things that needed to be done without editorial about the cost. He stayed because leaving was not something he was willing to do. He did not say any of this. He simply did not leave. And Delena understood the difference between silence and absence, and this was silence. They developed a rhythm in those summer months that neither of them designed or declared. It emerged the way natural things emerge, from proximity and necessity, and the repeated choice, made daily without ceremony, to be in the same room and face the same problems. Damon would appear in the morning, sometimes with coffee, always with information, always with a particular quality of focus that meant he had been working on something through the night hours that she had been sleeping. She would already be up, already at the table, already with her phone and her notes and her own accumulation of information. They would sit across from each other and work, and the working would shift into conversation, and the conversation would carry them through hours that would otherwise have been simply heavy. She learned things about him in those months that she could not have learned under any other conditions. Not dramatic things, not the large facts she had been accumulating since September of the previous year, but small things. The domestic architecture of who he was when there was no audience and no performance required. He made very good coffee and considered it a non-negotiable starting point for any morning. He read constantly, more than she had expected, moving through books with the speed of someone for whom reading had been one of the few reliably available pleasures across a very long life. He was funny in the dark hours, when the day's dangers had been managed and the night had settled, the humor dry and specific and occasionally so precisely aimed that she had to laugh despite the situation, despite everything. He was, she understood in those months, genuinely good company, not in the way that required lowering your standards or ignoring things, just good, interesting and honest and capable of the kind of attention that made you feel as though what you were saying was worth hearing. She had known this in pieces for over a year. Living inside it daily gave it a different texture. They searched for Stefan together. This was the practical project that gave the summer its structure. Tracing Klaus's movements through the connections available to them, gathering information through Alaric and through compelled witnesses, and through the network of supernatural contacts that Damon maintained with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who understood the value of intelligence. Stefan was with Klaus, that much was clear. Stefan was doing things for Klaus that had not yet been fully described. Things that arrived in rumor and second-hand account, and troubled Elena in ways she didn't entirely articulate aloud. The road trips were their own category of experience. She and Damon in cars together, in unfamiliar cities, following trails that sometimes led somewhere and sometimes dissolved into dead ends. The enforced proximity of travel, the hours in motion without the usual architecture of mystic falls to provide structure and excuse. They talked more in those cars than they talked at the boarding house. Or perhaps it was simply that the talking felt different without walls around it, without the possibility of one of them leaving when the conversation became more than they had planned for. She learned, on a road outside Atlanta, that he had spent time in the 20s with Stefan, a period she had not known about, a version of their relationship in which Damon had not yet given up on his brother, when both of them had been less careful and more reckless and fully present in the way of people who have decided to stop fighting their own nature. He described it without nostalgia, with a matter-of-fact tone he used for things he was telling the truth about, and she listened and let the picture of Damon Salvatore in 1922 settle into what she already knew of him, adding dimension to dimensions. She told him things too, in those cars, about her parents, about the specific texture of that first year of grief, about the person she had been before the accident, and the ways that person had not entirely survived. She did not perform these disclosures. She simply made them, to the road ahead, to the shifting landscape, to someone who she trusted to hear them without doing anything unnecessary with them. He didn't. He heard them and held them and asked the exact right question when a question was warranted, and was quiet when quiet was what was needed. This was not a small thing. She had met very few people who understood the difference. Chicago happened in September. They found Stefan there, which meant they found what Stefan had become under Klaus's direction, what it looked like when a man turned off the mechanism by which he registered consequence. Stefan, without his humanity, was not cruel in the way Damon was sometimes cruel. Sardonic and specific and always underneath performing something. Stefan, without his humanity, was simply absent. The warmth that had been the organizing principle of his personality was not suppressed or redirected. It was gone. He looked at Elena with the face she knew and felt nothing that he was willing to show. And she understood for the first time what the humanity switch actually meant, what it actually cost a person to flip it. Damon, watching Stefan, was quieter than usual. She saw him processing something that he did not have easy access to words for. Some accounting of what his brother had chosen to do and why. Some reckoning with the fact that Stefan had turned off his feelings in order to survive a situation he had entered in order to save Damon. The geometry of it was uncomfortable, and Damon sat inside the discomfort without deflecting, which was its own form of growth that she noted and did not comment on. They drove back without Stefan. This had been the likely outcome, and they had both known it. But knowing the likely outcome and arriving at it were different experiences, and the drive back carried the weight of what they had seen. Stefan was not coming home on their timeline. Stefan was in a particular kind of lost that could not be recovered through persuasion or planning. They would have to wait and find another way, and be patient with a situation that neither of them was temperamentally suited to patience about. She slept on the drive, which she did not intend to do, just the accumulated exhaustion of the trip and the weeks preceding it, her body making its own decisions. She woke as they were entering Mystic Falls and found that at some point while she slept, she had leaned towards him. Her head dropped toward his shoulder, and he had not moved away. He had simply driven, with her asleep beside him, with the particular stillness of someone who is being very careful not to disturb something. She registered this and straightened and said nothing, and he said nothing, and the nothing between them was a very particular kind of nothing. It was Rebecca who said it aloud first, which was Rebecca's way. She had very little patience for the kind of slow accumulation that Delena and Damon were engaged in for the months of almost, and the careful navigation of what could and couldn't be said. Rebecca compelled Delena in October in the school hallway with the directness of someone who wanted information and had the means to obtain it. She asked about Stefan. She asked about Damon. She asked what Delena actually felt. Delena, compelled, unable to construct the usual careful answer, said that she had feelings for Damon. Not a qualified statement, not a diplomatic framing designed to preserve everyone's dignity. Just the truth, extracted by someone who didn't care about its consequences, spoken in the fluorescent light of Mystic Falls High School for anyone present to hear. Damon heard about it. She knew he had heard about it because of the specific quality of his behavior in the days following. Not changed exactly, but calibrated differently. More careful about certain things and less careful about others. More willing to be in the same room without manufacturing a reason, and less willing to pretend that the reason was not the reason. He did not bring it up. He did not ask her about it, did not press her for confirmation or expansion. He simply knew, and she knew he knew, and they continued in the way of people who are managing the knowledge of something significant, while neither of them is ready to do anything about it yet. Stefan came back in November, or the beginning of a return that would take months to complete. The humanity came back in pieces, grudgingly, the way feeling always returns after numbness. Not in a clean line, but in fragments. Some things first, and other things resisting. He came back into Mystic Falls, and into the boarding house, and into the periphery of Elena's life. And the triangle that had been theoretical all summer became suddenly and uncomfortably real. Elena told Stefan the truth because she could not do anything else, because she was constitutionally incapable of the kind of sustained dishonesty that the alternative required. She told him that things had shifted while he was gone, that she was not the same person who had watched him leave in June, that there were feelings she was navigating that she owed him the honesty of naming. She did not say Damon's name. She did not need to. Stefan had known his brother for 160 years. He understood the sentence without the name. He did not respond with anger, which she had braced for. He responded with something quieter and more difficult, a grief that was completely controlled, that he did not perform at her or use as a weapon. He simply took it in, the information that he had come back to a different landscape than the one he had left, and held it with the dignity of someone who had chosen to feel things again, and was now learning that feeling things included this. She went home that night and sat in her room with the awareness that something had shifted that could not be shifted back, not because she had done something wrong, but because she had been honest. And honesty about this particular thing had weight and consequence and required being stood behind. She stood behind it. She was not ready to call it by its full name. She was not ready to go to Damon and say the thing that the compulsion had said for her in the school hallway. She was still in the space between knowing and saying, between feeling and choosing. That space that is not dishonesty, but simply the necessary duration of becoming certain. But she was certain. She understood, sitting in her room in November while Mystic Falls went about its evening around her, that she had been certain for some time. That the summer had not created something new, but had simply revealed something that had been there since a winter bedroom, and words she could not remember, and a warmth without a source that she had spent over a year carrying without knowing where it came from. She had feelings for Damon Salvatore. They were not going anywhere. They had survived his cruelty and her resistance and Catherine's interference and a ritual sacrifice and a summer of searching and a returned Stefan and everything the year had placed between them. They were, it turned out, the durable kind. She was not yet at the choosing, but she was very close. She was close enough to feel the edge of it, close enough to know that the choosing was coming, that she was moving toward it with the same inevitability she had spent the year not quite believing in. The wrong brother, she thought, on a November night that smelled like wood smoke and the particular cold of a Virginia autumn. The wrong brother who had been right about everything that mattered from the beginning. She thought she might be ready, soon, to stop pretending that was a problem. Wickery Bridge had a particular place in Eleanor Gilbert's life that no other location in Mystic Falls could claim. It was the site of her first loss and her first survival. The place where her parents had gone into the water and she had not. The geographic coordinate around which the story of her life had reorganized itself when she was 16 years old. She drove past it sometimes without looking. She drove past it other times and could not look away. It existed in her interior landscape the way certain places do, not just as a location, but as a before and after, a point of permanent division between the person she had been and the person she had become. She did not know, until it was too late to matter, that it would be the last place she ever went as a human being. The months between Stefan's return and the spring of her senior year were not quiet months, because quiet was not something Mystic Falls did consistently or well. The originals were in town, not just Klaus and Rebecca, but the fuller picture of that ancient family, with their 1,000 years of history and their internal wars, and their specific and catastrophic ways of involving themselves in other people's lives. The daggering and undaggering of original vampires. The politics of a family that had been tearing itself apart since before America was a country. All of it arrived in Mystic Falls with the density of history that had been building for 10 centuries and had finally found a small Virginia town to detonate in. Delena moved through that winter with the specific quality of attention of someone who understood that multiple things were true simultaneously, and that pretending otherwise was not available to her. Stefan was back and healing, reassembling his humanity piece by piece, with the effort of someone rebuilding a structure that had been taken apart, brick by brick. She cared for him, genuinely, in the way that did not stop being true, simply because other things were also true. And there was Damon, constant and present and carrying what she had not yet said to him with a patience that was uncharacteristic, and cost him something she could see in the quality of his restraint. She was still in the space between knowing and saying, but the space was getting smaller. the original family brought with them the question of the cure, a substance, possibly mythological, possibly real, that could theoretically reverse vampirism, return a vampire to the human life that transformation had ended. The implications of this arrived from multiple directions simultaneously. For Stefan, it represented something he had not dared to want. For Klaus, it represented a threat to his hybrid nature that needed to be controlled or destroyed. For Elena, it arrived as a question she was not sure she had the right answer to. Did she want to be human? She was human. She would be human until something changed. That, which she did not know yet, would happen before the school year ended. But the question had a different valence beneath the obvious one. It was also a question about what future she was orienting toward, what kind of life she was building, what the people she loved were going to be, and for how long. She did not resolve it. She let it remain a question and moved through the winter with the unresolved thing sitting in her peripheral vision. February brought the decade dance, a Mystic Falls High tradition. The school transformed to represent a different era each year, students in costume, the gymnasium strung with period-appropriate decoration. The year's choice was the 1920s, which had its own private irony given what she had learned about Damon and Stefan in Chicago in that decade. She went. She wore a beaded dress and her hair pinned up and moved through an evening that was simultaneously completely normal and deeply strange, which was the defining condition of her life by then. She and Damon danced that night, which they had done before and which by now had accumulated its own history of meaning. There was a way they moved together that had stopped requiring negotiation. He knew her rhythms, and she knew his, and the dancing had become a language they spoke without having to think about the grammar. She was aware of him in the specific way she was always aware of him. That physical attunement that she had long since stopped pretending was ordinary friendship. "You're thinking about something," he said, not a question, pitched low enough that it was only for her. "I'm usually thinking about something," she said. "Something specific, something you're not saying." She looked at him, at the familiar planes of his face, the eyes that she had learned to read with more accuracy than she read most people's, the quality of attention he was giving her that made most other experiences feel slightly dim by comparison. "Damon, don't," he said, and his voice was not unkind. "Not here, not in the middle of a gymnasium with everyone watching. When you're ready to say it somewhere real." She held his gaze, and if I'm ready. Something shifted in his expression, subtle, controlled, but she caught it. "Then find a moment that isn't this one, and I'll actually believe you." She almost laughed. She almost closed the distance. She did neither because he was right about the gymnasium, about the watching, about the quality of moment that a real thing required. But she registered the conversation as a marker, a named point on the map they were drawing together. The acknowledgement that there was something to say, and that both of them knew it, and that the saying was not a question of whether, but of when. The when was still coming. The spring kept moving toward it. March delivered Alaric in a configuration that nobody had planned for and nobody was entirely equipped to manage. Alaric's dark alter ego, the hunter, the version of him that emerged when his Gilbert ring had brought him back from death one too many times and left a fracture in his psyche that the darkness had moved into. The loss of Alaric as she had known him competent and sardonic and genuinely, steadily good. The adult in the town that had run out of functional adults was a grief that arrived on top of other griefs and settled there without a clear place to put it. There was no clean grief in Mystic Falls. Everything happened in the company of everything else. April arrived, and with it, the density of Endgame, the acceleration of multiple storylines toward collision, The Cure, the originals, Alaric's hunter nature, and his knowledge of original weaknesses. Delena moving through a senior year that was technically still a senior year, still attending school, still maintaining the performances of ordinary adolescence, while the world underneath those performances crackled with supernatural urgency. She and Damon had a fight in April that was not about what it appeared to be about, which was the operational strategy of whether to use Alaric's hunter knowledge to kill Klaus. The surface argument was real. They genuinely disagreed with the specificity of two people who had learned each other's reasoning well enough to know exactly where the disagreement lived. But underneath the strategy was the older argument, the one they had been having in various forms since they met, about risk, about what was worth protecting, about who got to make decisions about other people's safety. He thought she was willing to accept too much danger to herself. She thought he was willing to accept too much danger to other people to protect her. They were both right. They were both describing something true about each other. And the accuracy of it was what gave the fight its heat. She said something she should not have said. Something about not being able to trust his judgment because his feelings for her compromised it. She saw the impact of it arrive in his face before he had time to manage it. The fraction of a second when it landed before the armor went up. She regretted it immediately and did not immediately take it back because they were mid-fight and she was not yet the person who could hold both things at once in a fight, who could be angry and also be gentle. He left. She stood in the kitchen of the boarding house and listened to the door close with a controlled force that was Damon's version of slamming it. She called him an hour later. He answered on the first ring, which told her everything she needed to know about how over the fight was on his end. "I shouldn't have said that," she said. "You weren't wrong," he said. "I was wrong about how I said it." A pause. Then, "Yeah, okay." That was it. That was the entirety of the repair, and it was sufficient. And the sufficiency of it was its own form of information about what they had built. The night of May 10th began with a phone call. Rebecca was involved. Rebecca, who had her own relationship with Mystic Falls, her own history with the Salvatore brothers, her own investment in events that intersected catastrophically with Elena's trajectory that night. The details of the sequence matter less than its destination. Elena was in a car. Matt Donovan was driving. They were on Route 1, heading back into town, when Rebecca appeared on the road. It happened fast, the way accidents always happen. Not with the slow-motion drama of anticipated disaster, but with the brutal efficiency of physics doing what physics does. Rebecca in the road, Matt swerving, the car going off Wickery Bridge in the particular dark of a May night, the water coming up fast, the cold arriving all at once. Eleanor had been in this water before. Not this precisely, not conscious and aware in the sinking car. But the water had been the end of the story before, and she had been pulled from it. And now she was in it again. And the parallel was a fact she registered without having the time to fully experience it. Matt was unconscious. He needed to get out. This was the thought that organized everything else, that provided the decision before the decision was made. She could get out. The window was there, the pressure equalizing, the way out available to her. But Matt could not get himself out, and so the calculation was simple and terrible, and she made it without drama and without the sense of sacrifice that sacrifice is supposed to come with. She told Stefan, who had arrived, who had followed, who had come in the water for her, to take Matt first. She said it with the calmness of someone who has decided, not the calmness of someone who is numb. She was present and clear, and she made the choice with full understanding of what it might mean. Stefan took Matt. Stefan came back, but Elena was already gone, already beyond the surface, already past the threshold. She did not know, in those final seconds of her human life, that Meredith Fell had given her Damon's blood weeks earlier to save her from a head injury, and that the blood was still in her system, and that dying with vampire blood in your veins did not mean dying in the way she had understood dying to mean. She did not know any of this. She simply went. The transition was not immediate. There was a space between Elena dying and Elena waking. A gap that was not quite unconsciousness and not quite anything she had language for. She came back to herself on the shore of the quarry, and the world was different. Not visually, not immediately, but sensorially. The information arriving at a different volume, at a different resolution, colors slightly more saturated, sounds from distances that should have been too far. Her own heartbeat audible to her in a way it had never been audible before. The smell of the water and the grass and the people nearby arriving in layers she could distinguish and name. She understood before anyone told her. She understood with the body knowledge that comes before language, the deep cellular recognition of what she had become. She completed the transition. She had to. The only alternatives were completing it or dying for the second and final time. And she was not yet ready, in the way that the will to survive is more fundamental than almost any ideology about how survival ought to look. She fed. She became. The grief arrived alongside the transformation, which was its own particular cruelty. She had not wanted this. She had said so explicitly, repeatedly, over the course of the previous 2 years. She had watched Caroline adjust to vampirism with a resilience that Elena admired and had thought privately she might not match. She had watched Stefan live with the weight of what he was for 160 years and understood the cost. She had made a choice, deliberate, informed, clearly stated, that she did not want to be a vampire, that she wanted to grow old, that she wanted a human life with human endings. The choice had been made for her by a sequence of events that she could trace back through Rebecca and the road and the bridge and the blood Meredith had given her without full disclosure, and further back through years of supernatural entanglement that had made a night like this one inevitable in retrospect, if not in anticipation. Damon heard about it through Stefan. This detail matters. He did not hear it from her, did not receive it in any form that allowed him to manage his response before it arrived. He heard it from his brother, in a phone call, in the particular way that the worst information tends to arrive, without preparation and without the ability to immediately do anything about it. She did not know, for some time, what he had done upon hearing. She learned it later, piecemeal, from someone who had been nearby. He had gone very still. Damon Salvatore, who was almost never still, unless he was performing stillness, had simply stopped, stood in whatever room he was standing in, and gone completely quiet for a duration that lasted long enough that the person nearby had begun to be concerned. Then he had said, very quietly, to no one in particular, that he had wanted her to have a choice. That was all. That was the whole of the externally visible response, and it was more than he intended anyone to see, and it was true in a way that was worth understanding. He had not wanted Elena to be a vampire, not because he didn't want to be with her in that form, not because her becoming a vampire was a problem for him, but because she had not chosen it, because the life she had articulated wanting had been taken from her by accident and by other people's decisions, and Damon Salvatore, who had spent decades doing whatever he wanted without regard for other people's autonomy, had somewhere along the way developed a very specific and personal understanding of what it meant to have your choices taken from you. He came to her the next day, after the transition was complete, after the immediate chaos of what becoming a vampire actually required had been managed by the people managing it. He came and he sat across from her, and he looked at her with the eyes she could now see at a resolution she had not previously had access to, and he said nothing for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said finally. She looked at him. "It's not your fault." "Meredith used my blood," he said, without telling me she was going to. "I'm sorry." "You didn't know," she said. "No," he agreed, "but you should have been given the choice. You deserved the choice." She held his gaze across the space between them, and she felt the amplification of everything, the emotions heightened by newness, by the vampire biology doing what it did to fresh transitions, taking whatever feeling existed and turning up the volume until it was impossible to pretend you were not feeling it. What she felt when she looked at him was not new. She had been feeling it for long enough that the feeling had geological depth, but it arrived now with a clarity and an insistence that did not leave room for the usual management. She had died on Wickery Bridge. She had come back as something she had not chosen to be. The before and the after had never been so absolute. And Damon was here, as he had been here all summer, all winter, through the sacrifice and the return and the months of almost. Here, and looking at her, and sorry for something that was not his fault, because she had not been given the choice, and she understood, with the full force of amplified feeling, what it meant that this was the specific thing he was sorry about. Not that she was a vampire, not that things had become more complicated, that she had not been given the choice. He had always wanted her to choose freely, even when the free choice might not be him, even when the free choice might cost him everything he wanted. He had wanted her to choose, and what she had loved about him, in the accumulated months of paying attention without being ready to say it, was that this was true, that it was not a performance, that he had demonstrated it in the sire bond and in the second confession, and in a dozen smaller moments that she had been filing away without yet understanding what they added up to. They added up to this. Damon Salvatore, who'd spent a century and a half being the person who took what he wanted without asking, had become, in the specific territory of his love for her, someone who would not take anything at all, someone who would wait indefinitely for her to come to him with the full weight of her own free will behind her. She was a vampire now, with everything amplified and nothing resolved, and the question of what she felt for him larger than ever and no longer available to be managed at a comfortable distance. She was going to have to say it. She understood this with the particular clarity of someone whose options for deferral have been exhausted. The human life she had been planning, the one in which this got resolved eventually, slowly, on a timeline of her own making, was gone. What remained was what was actually true, what had always been true, what a year and a half of careful attention had been building toward. She was not ready to say it yet. She was newly dead, newly something else, newly in a body that was hers, but amplified, and she needed a moment. But the moment, she understood, was going to be brief. The before and the after were separated by a bridge in the dark, and she was on the other side now, and the other side did not offer the same excuses the before had offered. She looked at Damon across the room and thought, soon. She thought, not yet, but soon. And he looked back at her with the patient, careful, undemanding attention of someone who had already said what he needed to say and was simply waiting for the world to arrange itself around the truth of it. The bridge was behind her. What came next was in front of her. And between those two facts, in the charged and clarifying space of what she had become, the choosing was finally, irrevocably close. The first weeks of Elena's vampirism were a recalibration of everything she thought she understood about herself. It was not simply the physical adjustments, though those were substantial, the heightened senses arriving all at once and requiring management, the thirst presenting itself as a need that had no human equivalent, the strength that lived in her hands and made ordinary objects feel suddenly fragile. These things could be learned. Caroline had navigated them. There was a map for the physical territory, and Eleanor followed it with the methodical determination that had always been one of her less visible qualities. It was the emotional amplification that was harder. Vampire biology took whatever feeling existed prior to transition and turned up its volume. This was documented, discussed, warned about. She had heard it described by Stefan, by Caroline, by anyone who had navigated a transition. She had thought she understood what it meant. She had not understood what it meant for her specifically, in a specific emotional landscape, with her specific accumulation of unresolved feeling. She felt everything more. She felt grief more, for Jeremy's adjustment, for Jenna's absence, for the human life she had not chosen to end. She felt joy more in the occasional moments it arrived, with a brightness that was almost uncomfortable. She felt connection more, the warmth of Bonnie and Caroline, the complicated tenderness she carried for Stefan, the way Matt's steady human loyalty had always been a kind of anchor. And she felt Damon. That is the only accurate way to put it. The feeling that had been building for 18 months, that she had been managing and filing and carrying with careful deliberateness. It arrived, post-transition, at a volume that made management impossible. It was not new. It had not been created by the vampirism, but it was louder, more insistent, more present in her body than it had ever been in her human one, and the distance between feeling it and acting on it had never been smaller. She acted on it. It was not a dramatic moment, which was somehow appropriate. There was no orchestrated setting, no declaration, no single conversation that preceded it and resolved every outstanding question. There was simply an evening at the boarding house, Damon and Elena in the same room, the accumulated reality of everything between them reaching a density that required somewhere to go, and her crossing the room and kissing him with the full awareness of what she was doing. He kissed her back, not with the surprise of someone who had not seen it coming. He had seen it coming for long enough that the arrival was less a shock than a recognition, but with a care that was all his own, a quality of attention that had nothing performative in it, that was simply him being present in the moment he had been moving toward for a very long time. She pulled back and looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything that would have been adequate to the moment. So they said nothing, which was the right choice. They were together. After everything, the road in the fog, the winter bedroom, the compulsion, the tomb, the sacrifice, the almost in her room before she died, the bridge, the transition, they were finally, simply together. It lasted approximately 2 weeks before Stefan found the information about the sire bond. A sire bond was a rare phenomenon in vampire biology. A connection formed when a new vampire was turned by the blood of someone they had human feelings for. Not a compulsion, not a conscious manipulation. A residual of the transition itself, the feeling you carried into vampirism, finding a channel in the blood relationship between maker and made. The bonded vampire did not lose their free will in ordinary matters, but in the territory of the bond, in the specific emotional register that connected them to the vampire whose blood had turned them. Their inclinations aligned with that vampire's in ways that were not fully their own. Delena had been turned by Damon's blood. Delena had had human feelings for Damon prior to transition. Delena was, according to the research Stefan had been doing, with a determination that had something in it beyond academic interest, potentially sire bonded to Damon. The information arrived in the household of the Salvatore boarding house like a grenade, which was approximately what it was. Stefan presented it without cruelty and without theatre, with the measured delivery of someone who had worked very hard to separate his own feelings about the conclusion from the information itself. He had not done this perfectly. She could see the effort of it in the specific set of his jaw, in the controlled quality of his eyes. But he had done it genuinely, and she gave him credit for that, even in the middle of the devastation of what he was saying. What he was saying was, your feelings for Damon may not be entirely your own. What he was saying was, the love you have been building toward for 18 months, the love that survived everything the world placed between you and him, might be a function of vampire biology, rather than the free and autonomous choice you believed it to be. She sat with this. She sat with it for a long time, in the particular stillness of someone who is being very careful not to react before they have finished thinking. Who understands that the first response is not always the true one? Then she went to Damon. He was not surprised that she had come. He was not surprised by the information either, which she had wondered about, whether he had known or suspected, whether the sire bond had been something he was aware of and had not said. He had not known. She believed him, which was his own form of information about the state of her trust in him. He had not known, and finding out landed on him with the particular weight of something that takes the best thing you have and renders it uncertain. She watched him process it with the specific honesty that she had come to rely on in him. Not a managed response, not a performance of the appropriate reaction, but the actual working of the information through his consciousness in real time. His face did something complicated and then settled into something quieter and harder. Does it feel like the bond to you? she asked. "Can you tell?" "I don't know what it feels like from the inside," he said. "I've never been bonded." "Does it matter?" she asked. And she was asking the question from both directions simultaneously. Asking whether it mattered to him, and asking whether it should matter to her. "Yes," he said. He said it without hesitation and without apology. "It matters. Because if what you feel isn't yours, if it came from the transition rather than from you, then I don't want it." He looked at her directly, with the open-eyed quality she only saw when he was saying something he had decided to say at full volume. "I've spent a long time wanting something real from you. Not because of my blood in your system, because of you. And if this isn't that, then it's not what I want." She looked at him and felt the feeling she always felt when he said true things without decorating them. The particular impact of someone who has learned honesty at great personal cost, choosing to deploy it anyway. "What if I can't tell the difference?" she said. "Then we find out," he said. "We find a way to test it. And if the feelings are real, they survive the test." The testing of the sire bond became the project of the weeks that followed, conducted alongside everything else Mystic Falls demanded, and requiring a kind of methodical attention to her own inner life that Delena found simultaneously necessary and painful. She tested her inclinations against the bond's reported parameters. She watched for the moments when her feelings seemed to be responding to Damon's desires rather than her own. She tried to locate the difference between loving him and being pulled toward him, between choice and compulsion. The problem was that the difference was genuinely hard to find, not because it wasn't there, she believed it might be there, but because she had loved him as a human, had been moving toward him for months before the transition, and trying to separate the bond from the feeling was like trying to separate water that had been added to water and identify which molecules were which. She could not reliably do it, and the inability to reliably do it was its own form of answer, though not the answer anyone wanted. Damon, in the meantime, was doing something she had not anticipated and could not have predicted from the version of him she had met in September 2 years earlier. He was being careful, not distant. He had not retreated into the performance of not caring, had not reached for the armor that cruelty provided, but careful, deliberate about not pressing her, not using the bond's mechanics to make things easier for himself, not leveraging the influence he might have had in the ways that influence could be leveraged. He could have. That was the part that stayed with her when she turned it over. A sire bond was a form of power, and Damon had never had a reliable relationship with the restraint of power. He had used compulsion casually and occasionally cruelly in the first years of his existence in her life. He had taken what he wanted across a century and a half of being the kind of vampire who didn't ask first. And now he had a bond that would have made obtaining what he wanted from Delena significantly easier. And he was not using it. He was not using it because what he wanted from her was the version that was entirely hers. Nothing less would satisfy. She told this to Caroline, who was her most reliable thinking partner in these weeks. Caroline, who had spent more time thinking about the sire bond than anyone else, because Caroline was constitutionally thorough about anything she took seriously, which was most things. Caroline was not Damon's advocate by nature. Her history with him was too specifically painful for easy advocacy. But she was Eleanor's advocate, absolutely and without reservation. And being Eleanor's advocate meant helping Eleanor understand what she actually felt rather than telling her what to feel. "What does it feel like?" Caroline asked one afternoon, when he's not in the room. Eleanor thought about it. "Like something is missing," she said. "But not in the way of compulsion, not like a requirement, more like the way it feels when someone you love is somewhere else. You're fine, but you're aware of the absence." "That sounds like missing someone," Caroline said. "Not like being controlled by someone." "I know," Eleanor said, "but I can't trust my own read of it. That's the problem." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "Can I say something that you're not going to like?" "Probably." "You've been in love with him since before the transition," Caroline said. "I know you know that. But I don't think you fully accepted it as something that was real and voluntary and yours. And I think the sire bond gave you permission to doubt something you would have found a way to doubt regardless, because you've been looking for permission to doubt it since the beginning." Eleanor did not respond immediately. She sat with the accuracy of it, which was the kind of accuracy that landed differently than comfortable truth, the kind that required sitting with rather than immediately agreeing or disagreeing. She was still sitting with it when Damon came to her with a decision. He had made the decision alone, she could see, had arrived at it through his own process without consulting her, which would have annoyed her if the decision had been anything other than what it was. He came to her with the specific quality of someone who has done something that cost them significantly and has decided that the cost was appropriate. He told her he was going to break the sire bond, not by destroying the connection. That wasn't how it worked. The bond was broken by distance and instruction, by the bonded vampire being told by the sire to live their life freely, to follow their own feelings wherever they led, to make their choices without the sire's influence weighing on them. It required him to tell her, essentially, to let him go, to not choose him unless she chose him from a place that was entirely her own. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Yes, I do," he said, "because if I don't, neither of us ever knows. And I need to know, Elena. I need to know if what you feel is yours." "What if it goes away?" she said. "What if the bond breaks and the feeling goes with it?" He held her gaze with the steadiness she'd come to understand was his particular form of courage, not the dramatic bravery of throwing himself between her and danger, which he did reflexively, but the quieter courage of being honest about something that frightened him. "Then I would rather know that," he said, "than spend however long we might have together wondering." He said the words that broke the bond with the gentleness of someone performing an amputation, knowing it was necessary, doing it as cleanly as possible, not pretending it didn't hurt. He told her to stop defining herself by him, to live without him if that was what she found when she looked clearly, to make her choices from a free and uncompromised place. She left. He had asked her to leave, to put distance between them, to let the bond have the space to dissolve. She went to Caroline's. She went to her old house, to the room she had grown up in. She sat in the quiet of the places that were hers before he was hers, and she looked very carefully at what she felt. The feeling did not diminish. It did not simplify or clarify or resolve into something that felt different from what it had been. It remained specific and persistent, and his, shaped like him, attached to the particular person he was, rather than to a vampire whose blood had turned her. It remained in the way of things that have geological depth, things that were laid down over time in the accumulated sediment of attention and honesty and being seen. She had missed him in the distance, not as a requirement, as a person. She went back to him, not immediately. She gave the test the duration it required, gave the breaking of the bond the time to mean something. She sat with the clarity of her own feeling for long enough to be certain that what she was returning with was hers. And then she returned. She told him what she had found. It didn't go away, she said. I looked for the bond, and I looked for the feeling, and they're not the same thing. What I feel for you is not the bond. It was there before the bond, and it's there after it, and it has your name on it in a way that doesn't come from blood. He looked at her for a long moment. She saw the working of it in his face, the disbelief that had been his default position regarding his own worthiness of love for over a century, the careful inspection of what she was saying for signs of continued bonding, the slow arrival of something that was not quite certainty, but was close enough. You're sure, he said. I'm sure, she said. And then, because she was a vampire now with amplified everything, and no remaining patience for managing the distance between what she felt and what she said. I love you, Damon. It's mine. It was always mine. And I'm not going to keep not saying it because it's inconvenient or complicated, or because I'm still trying to protect everyone from the fact of it. He crossed the room. He took her face in his hands with the care of someone who is holding something they have been waiting to hold for long enough that the waiting has become part of their identity. Someone who is learning in real time what it feels like to stop waiting. He said her name, just her name. But the way he said it contained the 18 months and the road and the compulsion and the bourbon and the dance and the bedroom and the sacrifice and the bridge. All of it, compressed into 2 syllables spoken by someone for whom those 2 syllables had become the organizing principle of his entire existence. They were together, this time without the doubt underneath it, without the question mark that the sire bond had inserted between the feeling and its legitimacy. This time with the full weight of free choice behind it, on both sides, in both directions. The question of real had been answered. What they had was real. What they had was theirs, and it had taken everything the world had placed between them to make that certainty available. And neither of them was inclined, standing in its presence at last, to take it lightly. There is a difference between loving someone and being in love with someone, in the full light of their knowing it, with nothing withheld and nothing managed, and nowhere left to hide. The first can be done at a distance, in the private architecture of your own interior, without the exposure that the second requires. The second asks you to be seen completely, not just the parts you have curated for presentation, but the whole of you, the difficult parts and the contradictory parts and the parts you would have preferred to keep in the dark. It asks you to let another person have access to the real thing, and to trust that they will not use that access carelessly. Lena had been in love with Damon for long enough that the love had roots. What was new was the light. She learned him differently in those first months of being openly together, not as a new person, because she had been learning him for 2 years, but as the same person seen from a different angle. The parts she had understood in shadow becoming visible in full. He wasn't changed by being loved, not fundamentally different in the way that romance stories sometimes suggested people became when they were finally chosen. he was still Damon, still sardonic and still difficult, and still capable of decisions that made her furious in the specific way that only someone you know completely can make you furious. But there was something new available to him, a frequency he could operate at that had not been available before, something that existed in the register of easy, of not having to perform the absence of care because the care was simply acknowledged. He was funny. She had known this, had witnessed the humor for 2 years, but living inside it was different from observing it. The specific quality of his wit, the way it was always doing 2 things at once, entertaining on the surface and saying something true underneath, became one of her daily pleasures. She laughed more than she had in years, which surprised her and which she suspected was not unrelated to the amplification of her vampire emotions, but which also had a genuine source that had nothing to do with biology. He taught her to feed without hurting people, which was a more intimate process than it appeared from the outside. It required her to trust him at the precise moment that her control was weakest, required her to listen to his specific instructions while the thirst was making other recommendations. He was patient in a way that was not natural to him and that she could see him working at, tempering the impatience that was his default setting with a deliberateness that was itself a form of love, the love that shows itself through effort rather than declaration. Again, he would say, when she pulled back from a compelled human too late or too soon, his voice calibrated to the register of someone teaching rather than correcting. "I'm trying," she would say. "I know. Again." The repetition was the lesson. She got better. She got good, eventually. Good enough that the process became manageable. Another skill in the catalogue of things vampirism required and rewarded. He watched her get good with an expression she had learned to read as the one he wore when he was proud of something and was being careful about how much he let it show. They fought. This was also part of it, part of the real thing, as opposed to the anticipated thing. They fought with the specific efficiency of 2 people who know each other's reasoning well enough to target it precisely, who understand where the load-bearing structures of each other's positions are, and can therefore identify exactly where to apply pressure. The fights were not comfortable, but they were honest, which was their own kind of intimacy. He still did things she did not sanction. He still made unilateral decisions about the management of threats to her safety that she had not been consulted on, still operated from the assumption that his read of a situation trumped hers when her safety was involved. She called him on this every time, with the patience of someone who understood it was coming from love, and the firmness of someone who understood that love was not a sufficient excuse for it. He was working on it. This was the true thing that she held on to in the harder moments. Not that he had changed. Not that he had resolved the part of himself that ran on protective instinct before consulting reason, but that he was working on it. That he brought her the awareness of his own pattern and sat with her assessment of it and tried again. That was not nothing. There was, in fact, a great deal. The cure arrived in their relationship as a question Damon handled imperfectly and honestly, which was characteristic of how he handled most things he'd complicated feelings about. The cure had been Silas's mythology first, a substance tied to an ancient story about a man who had found a way to make immortality reversible, who had wanted to die and had been denied it. The quest for it had pulled multiple people into its orbit, for Delena, who had not chosen vampirism, who had wanted a human life. The cure was theoretically the answer to a question she had been living with since the bridge. Damon's feelings about the cure were not simple, and he did not pretend they were. He told her the truth, which was that he did not want her to be human, not because he preferred her as a vampire, not because her vampirism made things easier for him. It made things more complicated in several specific ways, but because human meant mortal and mortal meant temporary, and he had spent enough time in love with things that did not last to be sanguine about the prospect of loving Delena Gilbert across the span of a human life that would end in decades, while his did not. "You're afraid of losing me," she said, not as an accusation, as an observation. "I've lost things before," he said. "People. Not people like you, but people who mattered. And I've survived it, technically. But I don't want to survive you. I want to be here for whatever you are, for as long as you are it." "That's not your choice," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm just telling you the truth of what I want. What you do with the cure is yours. I'm not trying to take that from you." She believed him. She took the truth of his fear and held it alongside the truth of her own uncertainty about what she wanted. And she did not make any immediate decisions because the cure was not immediately available, and the question could wait for the question to be answerable. What could not wait was Jeremy. Jeremy's death came in the winter of the 4th season. Not a death that could be undone. Not a death with a supernatural loophole. Jeremy Gilbert, who had died before and come back before, died in a way that was final, and Delena was the one who found him, and the grief of it was the largest thing she had experienced since the bridge, since the accident, since every loss that had preceded this one, and had been preparing her inadequately for the loss of her brother. The grief was incompatible with functioning. This was the clinical way to put what she experienced in the hours after Jeremy died. A devastation that her amplified vampire emotions turned into something that threatened to consume everything else, that left no room for anything beside itself. She had lost her parents. She had lost Jenna. She had lost herself in various ways across the preceding 2 years. And now she had lost Jeremy, and the compounded weight of it was more than she knew how to carry. She turned off her humanity. The decision, if it could be called a decision, did not feel like one. It felt like relief. The sudden cessation of a pain that had become unbearable. The silence that arrived when you stopped the mechanism generating the noise. She had known, abstractly, that vampires could do this. She had watched Stefan do it. She had understood the cost from the outside. From the inside, in the immediate aftermath of Jeremy's death, the cost was theoretical and the relief was concrete. And she chose the concrete thing. The Delena without humanity was not entirely unlike the Delena with it, which was in some ways the most disturbing part. She was still intelligent, still verbally precise, still capable of the social navigation that her human self had been good at. But the warmth was gone, not suppressed, not available to be reached if you found the right approach. Absent, the care that had been the center of her personality, the love that had been the organizing principle of who she was, simply not present. She said things to people she loved that she would not have said with her feelings intact. She was cruel to Caroline with the specific cruelty of someone who knew where the vulnerabilities were. She told Stefan things about himself that were true and that she had always kept private out of care for him. and she looked at Damon with eyes that registered him as someone significant in her history without feeling the significance. He did not turn away. This mattered in the accounting she would do later. That Don Salvatore, who had his own long history of switching off, who understood the appeal of not feeling better than almost anyone alive, did not turn away from the version of her that had turned off. He stayed. He worked the problem. He was not gentle about it, because the version of Elena without humanity was not a person who responded to gentleness, but he was present in the way of someone who has decided that absence is not available. He and Stefan arrived at a rare alignment in this. Both of them wanting Elena back, both of them willing to do whatever it took. The brotherly rivalry that had characterized their dynamic for a century and a half set aside in favor of the shared project of reaching her. She watched them working together through the fog of her turned-off feelings and found it almost interesting from a purely observational standpoint, the way you find interesting things that you do not yet have access to caring about. The motel room was where it broke. They had been forcing her to confront her grief in pieces, navigating the specific resistance of a vampire who doesn't want to feel and who has the intelligence to stay ahead of most attempts to make her. But in the motel room, with Stefan and Damon both present, both refusing to leave, the accumulated pressure of their sustained presence found the fracture in her resistance that she had not known was there. They made her think about Jeremy, not abstractly, specifically. The particular person he had been, the specific texture of having him in her life, the concrete and irreplaceable details of her brother as he had actually existed. She had been keeping herself at a sufficient remove from the specifics that the grief couldn't gain purchase. They wouldn't let her maintain the distance. They stayed close and kept talking and kept returning her to the reality of what she had lost, until the reality was larger than the wall she had built around it. She broke. The humanity came back the way feeling always returns after anesthesia. All at once, before you're ready. Too much and too immediate. She wept in the way of someone for whom weeks of damn grief arrived simultaneously. The full weight of Jeremy and her parents and Jenna and all of it. The compounded losses of the preceding 2 years released in a single unmanageable flood. Damon held her through it. He did not say anything useful or comforting, because there was nothing useful or comforting to say, and he had learned over the course of knowing her when to speak and when to simply be present. He was present, steadily and without conditions, while she came back to herself through the grief rather than away from it. She was, in the aftermath, enormously tired. Not the physical tiredness that sleep resolved, the deeper tiredness of someone who has been through something genuinely difficult and is still in the middle of its aftermath. She was raw in the way of a healing thing, where the rawness was evidence of recovery rather than damage. He was there when she came back to herself. He was there in the tired aftermath and in the slow reassembly of the life that Jeremy's death had disrupted, and in the daily management of what it meant to be grieving while being a vampire, while being the person at the center of a mystic force that never fully stopped requiring things from her. She told him she loved him again, in the aftermath of the humanity switch, not as a declaration that needed announcement, but as a simple fact she was reporting, as something she wanted him to know she had come back to voluntarily, without the turned-off numbness without the sire bond and without any of the complicating factors that had surrounded the feeling for so long. He received it quietly, with the specific quality of someone who has been holding something carefully for a long time and is learning still how to hold it without bracing for it to be taken away. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, reading what was in his face. "I know," he said. "I'm just..." He stopped. He tried again. "I'm not used to it staying." "Get used to it," she said. He almost smiled. The almost smile that she had catalogued from the early days, from the boarding house and the town square, and all the rooms she had watched him in, while telling herself she was simply paying attention. It arrived with the same quality it always had, ironic on the surface, and something much less ironic underneath. "I'm working on it," he said. The spring moved towards summer, and the relationship moved with it, past the sire bond and the humanity switch and the cure question, and into something that felt, for the first time, like the beginning of a sustained thing, not free of difficulty. They were constitutionally incapable of free of difficulty, both of them, and Mystic Falls was constitutionally incapable of providing the conditions for it. But sustained, real in the way of things that have been tested and have not broken. She had loved him since before she knew it. She had been choosing him since before she admitted it. And now the choosing was acknowledged, and the love was mutual, and the real thing, the version of their relationship that was simply what it was, without apology or management or the exhausting work of pretending it was something else, was finally the version they were living in. It was not an ending. She understood this, in the way that the long acquaintance with loss had taught her to understand that the good things are not endings but middles, not conclusions but ongoing presences that require daily renewal. She was in love with Damon Salvatore, freely, clearly, with full knowledge of what he was and had been, and was still working on being. The wrong brother who had been right about everything. The monster who had chosen, daily and at cost, to be more than the monster. The man who had told her she deserved a love that consumed her before she knew his name, and had turned out to be the person he was describing. The real thing, theirs, finally, irrevocably, in the light where both of them could see it. There is a version of love that exists only in good conditions, that requires fair weather and proximity and the absence of the particular pressures that reveal what something is actually made of. And then there is the other kind, the kind that gets put in the fire and examined for what survives, the kind that discovers its own dimensions not through comfort, but through the specific and ungentle process of being tested by everything the world can arrange against it. Damon and Elena's love was always going to be the second kind. They had been telling each other that since the beginning, in the accumulated evidence of everything they had survived to get to each other. What the 5th season and the 6th season added to that evidence was the test of separation. Not the separation of distance or disagreement, but the deeper kind. The kind where one person is gone and the one who remains has to decide every day whether to keep being the person who loves someone who is not there to receive it. Whitmore College arrived as the attempt at normal that it always was. Elena and Caroline and college, new environment, the deliberate construction of a life that felt like the future rather than the perpetual crisis management of Mystic Falls. Elena was genuinely trying. This mattered. She was not performing the attempt at normal. She was making it with the sincerity of someone who understood that survival was not the same as living and who wanted, after everything, to live. Damon was not at Whitmore. They were navigating for the first time a relationship that existed primarily over distance, phone calls, visits, the logistics of two people whose lives were occupying different geographies. It was ordinary in the way that college relationships are ordinary, and the ordinariness of it was something she wanted to lean into rather than resist. Then Augustine arrived. The Augustine vampire program at Whitmore was not a new thing. It had been operating for generations, a secret society with a medical research component that was less research and more sustained atrocity. Vampires captured and kept and experimented on with the specific cruelty of people who had decided that a certain category of being did not qualify for moral consideration. The Salvatore brothers had crossed paths with Augustine before, in a way Delena had not known about. Damon had been an Augustine vampire. In the 1950s, he had been captured and held at Whitmore for years, not days or weeks, but years, subjected to experiments that she could not fully absorb. When she learned the details, the specific and named cruelties that had been inflicted on him across that stretch of time. He had survived it. He had escaped it eventually. And in the escaping of it, he had done something she had not known was part of his history. Something with a named victim, a specific and terrible act that belonged to the category of things he had done that she had not yet been asked to reckon with. The Augustine history arrived in their relationship like what it was. A revelation that required her to hold something genuinely difficult about him. Something that was not the abstract darkness she had long since made her peace with, but a specific and named harm done to a specific and named person. She sat with it. She didn't immediately forgive it or immediately condemn it. She did what she had learned to do with the difficult fact about Damon. She looked at it directly. She looked at the context of it. She looked at the man sitting in front of her, who was telling her the truth and not softening it. "I know what I did," he said. "I'm not asking you to be okay with it." "Then what are you asking?" she said. "Nothing," he said. I needed you to know. All of it. Not the edited version." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Why?" He looked at her with the open-eyed quality she had learned to recognize as his most honest register. "Because you love me," he said, "and I needed you to love the actual person, not the version that's had certain things removed. For palatability." She absorbed this. She recognized what it was, not justification, not request for absolution, simply the same demand for honesty that had been the organizing principle of what they were to each other since the beginning. He wanted to be known completely, and he wanted whatever she felt for the complete version to be the real thing. She stayed. She had the full picture now, or fuller, and she stayed. It was not a simple stay-in, and it was not cost-free, but it was genuine, and it was chosen, and it was hers. The travelers arrived as the season's larger threat, an ancient community of witches whose magic operated differently from the Bennett line, whose agenda intersected catastrophically with the geography of Mystic Falls and the specific supernatural properties it had accumulated over centuries. Their magic required Damon and Eleanor's blood, the last remaining doppelganger bloodlines, and the process of extracting what they needed left collateral damage that rippled through everyone connected to those bloodlines. She and Damon were separated by it repeatedly, pulled in different directions by the demands of a threat that was too large and too diffuse to be resolved through any of the usual methods. They were pulled apart by circumstance and by the specific way that traveler magic worked on their bodies, on the doppelganger connection that made them useful and therefore made them targets. She was used to being a target by then. She was less accustomed to being one alongside him, to the particular experience of both of them being in danger simultaneously, without the ability to protect each other. He could not be in two places, neither could she. The impossibility of coverage was its own form of loss. Mystic Falls became uninhabitable as the season reached its conclusion. The travelers completing their ritual in a way that made the town itself lethal to supernatural creatures. The magic that had built up in the town's geography turned against the very beings it had once housed. The resolution of it required a sacrifice that the season had been moving toward, that she had seen coming in pieces and had not been able to prevent. Damon died. He died getting Mystic Falls back. He and Bonnie on the other side as it collapsed, trapped in the space between death and whatever came after, unable to get back through before the anchor broke entirely. She was on this side when it happened, was present for the moment the other side dissolved, and took with it everyone who hadn't found their way back. She felt it before she was told. There was something in the atmosphere of that moment. Some absence arriving in the register of things she had not known she was tracking until they stopped. She felt it the way you feel the quality of a room change when someone leaves it, and then she was told, and the feeling had a name. The grief was not like the previous griefs, though it shared their family. It was specific to him, to Damon, to the particular person, to all the collected texture of knowing him and being known by him, and the specificity of what they had built together. She had lost people before. She had lost everyone before, in various configurations, and she had survived each time and would survive this. But surviving was not the question. Surviving, she knew how to do. Living without him was the new geography. She did not handle it gracefully. She would not have claimed to. Grace in grief was an aspiration that the actual experience of grief rarely cooperated with. And she had been tested past grace several times already and understood that what you actually looked like on the other side of the worst thing was not always the composed version you imagined in advance. She took pills, a witch's compound, obtained through the specific desperation of someone who had located the precise tool for the particular unbearability she was experiencing. The pills let her see him, not a real him, not a communication from wherever he was, but a hallucination sufficiently detailed and sufficiently voiced that the absence became temporarily bearable. She knew they weren't real. She took them anyway because real and bearable were not always the same thing, and sometimes bearable was enough. She was not proud of this and did not pretend to be. Damon was alive, in the sense that the other side had not been the end of him. He and Bonnie had landed somewhere else, a prison world constructed around the date of May 10th, 1994, a single day on endless repeat, an elaborate supernatural punishment that repeated the same morning endlessly without variation or escape. He was not dead. He was somewhere she could not reach, in a repetition she had no access to, learning to exist in a day that never moved forward. 1994 on repeat, with Bonnie as his only company, working the problem of escape with a methodical stubbornness that had always been one of his less advertised qualities. He did not give up. This was the thing she would understand later, when she knew what had happened in the prison world, that across the months of that repetitive purgatory, Damon had not stopped working toward the way out. He had not turned off his feelings. He had not settled into the comfortable numbness that the sameness of the prison world offered. He had stayed present and kept feeling and kept working because he intended to get back. She did not know any of this while it was happening. She knew only the absence. The absence was long enough that she made a decision she would not have believed herself capable of making. She asked Alaric to compel away her memories of loving Damon. She asked him to remove the specific and detailed interior architecture of what they had been to each other. Not the factual record, not the knowledge that he had existed and that she had known him, but the feeling of it, the love itself, the specific sensation of what it had been, extracted from the places it lived in her, so that she could function in a world that contained his absence. Alaric performed the compulsion. He had his own complicated feelings about Damon, about what Damon had been to Elena and to himself over the preceding years, and he performed it with the care of someone who understood the weight of what he was being asked to do, and who loved Elena enough to do it anyway, because she was asking. She woke up the next day different, not visibly. She was still Elena, still recognizably herself, still moving through the world with her own history and her own relationships and her own understanding of who she was. But the specific warmth that had lived in her in the places where Damon had been was gone. Where there had been feeling, there was now simply the fact of him. A person she had apparently known, a vampire whose history she understood, someone she could discuss without the weight that ought to have accompanied the discussion. She thought she had loved him. She knew in the factual sense that she had, but she could not access what that had felt like, could not find the texture of it in the places it had been stored. It was the winter bedroom in reverse, but worse, because the winter bedroom had been done to her, and this she had done to herself. Damon came back. He came back through a door that Bonnie found, through the work of months of repetitive problem solving in the prison world, through the sheer refusal to accept that the other side's collapse was the end of the story. He crossed back into the living world with the specific quality of someone who has been through something genuinely difficult and is trying not to show how difficult it was. And he came back to Mystic Falls looking for the person he had been fighting his way back to. Elena did not remember loving him. She knew him. She was not unkind. She was never unkind. It was not in her nature. And she had the facts of their relationship available to her, even if she could not feel them. But the warmth was not there. The pull was not there. The specific recognition that arrived when two people who love each other occupy the same room was not there. She looked at him and saw someone she apparently cared about very much once, and felt the fact of it without the feeling of it. He understood immediately. She watched him understand it, watched the working of it arrive in his face in the specific way of something too large to immediately process, too painful to immediately manage. He had fought his way back from a purgatory of repetitive days, through months of isolation and problem solving and the sustained effort of choosing to keep feeling rather than going numb, because he was coming back to her, and she did not remember him. He did not collapse. She would learn later what it cost him to remain functional in that first encounter, to respond to her careful, factual friendliness with something that was not the devastation she had inadvertently delivered. He was very good at not collapsing when he needed not to collapse. He had had 170 years of practice. He asked Alaric what had happened. He learned what she had done and why she had done it. And then he sat with the knowledge that the person he loved had loved him enough, in his absence, to have the love removed because she could not survive having it and losing it simultaneously. That night, he did something she only heard about afterward. He went somewhere alone and he sat with the full weight of what had happened and what it meant. That she had chosen to stop remembering him rather than carry the grief of losing him, that the love he had spent 2 years learning to trust had been compelled into silence by the very person who had taught him to believe in it. And then he got up and started working out how to help her remember, not by demanding it, not by pressing the information on her against her will, or insisting that she owed him the recovery of what she had let go, but by being, daily and without insistence, the person she had apparently once loved, by trusting that the feeling, if it had been real, and he had tested that, had broken the sire bond specifically to be certain, would find its way back if given the right conditions. He was patient. Damon Salvatore, who was constitutionally resistant to patience, who had spent a century and a half not being patient about the things he wanted, was patient because she was worth the patience. She always had been. And he had come too far, through too much, to give up now simply because the ending required more of him than he had anticipated. The cost of love he had learned across the preceding years was never paid in a single installment. It was paid incrementally, daily, in the ordinary willingness to keep choosing someone even when the choosing was difficult and even when the return was uncertain. He had learned this from her. He intended to demonstrate that he had learned it. He waited. He stayed. He did not leave. The real things had a way of refusing to stay buried. She had told him that once, or something like it, in the months before the bridge. She had been right about it then. He trusted she would be right about it now. The campaign to make Elena remember was not a campaign in any dramatic sense. There were no grand gestures, no orchestrated moments designed to break through the compulsion with the force of cinematic feeling. Damon understood, better than most, that compulsion did not work that way. That the memories it sealed were not sitting just beneath the surface waiting for the right emotional key. They were genuinely gone from the place they had been stored, relocated or dissolved, and what remained was simply the negative space where they had lived. What he had was not a plan. What he had was the willingness to occupy that negative space every day and trust that something in her would recognize the shape of it. He was around. This was the beginning and the middle, and almost the entirety of the strategy. He was present, consistently, and without the performance of significance in the daily geography of her life. Not pressing, not positioning himself in ways that would have read as manipulation to someone paying close attention. And Elena was always paying close attention. He was simply there, in the room she was in the conversations she was having, in the periphery of her days, with the particular quality of someone who has decided that showing up is the only honest thing available to him. She found him interesting. This was the first thing she noticed, without the memories to explain why. She found herself paying attention to him in the way she had apparently always paid attention to him, drawn to the specific frequency of his humor and his honesty, and the way he said true things surrounded by things that were easier to say. She did not have access to the history of that attention, could not reach back through the months of accumulation to understand where it had started and what it had grown from. She just found him interesting, in the way of something the body knows before the mind catches up. She told Caroline this one afternoon, with the careful phrasing of someone reporting something they are not sure how to categorize. "I don't feel what I'm supposed to feel," she said. "I know what we were. I know the facts of it. But when he's in the room, there's something. It doesn't feel like nothing." Caroline looked at her with the expression of someone exercising significant restraint. "What does it feel like?" "Like a word I know but can't remember," Elena said. "Like something that should be right there and isn't quite." What she was describing, though she did not have the framework for it, was the same phenomenon Damon had understood from the winter bedroom years earlier. The discovery that compelling a memory did not always reach the thing underneath the memory. The residue of genuine feeling that lived in a place below the reach of words and their removal. The warmth without a source. The shape of something real persisting in the space where the real thing had been. It was there. Alaric's compulsion had reached the explicit memories, the named moments, the specific catalogue of what had happened between them. It had not reached the part of her that simply knew, without knowing why, that Damon Salvatore was someone to whom she was connected in a way that had no adequate explanation. He gave her the choice. This was the thing she understood about him. In the slow process of knowing him again, without the history, that he was, in the specific territory of his love for her, someone who consistently chose her autonomy over his own preferences. She saw it in the way he handled the memory situation, in the absence of pressure or urgency, or the kind of pointed behavior that would have constituted unfair influence. He had access to information she did not have, could have used that access to manipulate her toward the outcome he wanted, and he did not. He gave her the choice. He told her that Alaric could restore the memories if she wanted them restored, that the compulsion was not permanent, that what she had asked to have removed was still available to her if she decided she wanted it back. And then he told her that the decision was entirely hers, that he was not going to attempt to influence it through the accumulated weight of his daily presence, or through any version of the argument that she owed it to her past self to remember. "What if I don't want them back?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then you don't get them back, and we figure out whatever comes next from here." "That's it. That's it," he said. And she looked at him and found the answer to the question she had been circling since he came back from the prison world. Not whether he loved her, because that was visible in every room he entered on her behalf, but whether he was the person she would want him to be, if she were choosing from scratch, if she were looking at the available information with no history, no accumulated feeling, no debt to a past that she could not currently access. She decided she would look at the available information. She watched him in the weeks that followed, with the specific attention she had apparently been giving him for 2 years without knowing it was a habit. She watched how he moved through a crisis, which Mystic Falls continued to provide with reliable frequency. She watched what he protected and what he sacrificed and what he refused to sacrifice, regardless of the strategic logic for doing so. She watched what he was like when things were difficult and when they were ordinary, and when they were the specific kind of dark that mystic fools specialized in. She found, at the end of the watching, approximately what her compelled memories had apparently found at the end of 2 years of the same process. She found someone worth knowing, someone whose damage and whose grace were not in conflict, but were, in fact, the same phenomenon. Someone who had been hurt in ways that had shaped him toward cruelty and had chosen, against the grain of that shaping, to be otherwise. Someone funny and honest and difficult, and, underneath the performance of not caring with an intensity that organized everything else. She asked Alaric to restore the memories. They came back all at once, which was not how she had imagined it, and which was, in retrospect, the only way it could have happened. Not sequentially, not the way a narrative is told, but simultaneously, the whole of it arriving together. Every moment and every conversation, and every time he had said something true, and every time she had filed it away, and the night on the road she had not been able to remember, and the winter bedroom she could now access for the first time, with full understanding of what it had been. The accumulation of 2 years returned in the space of a breath, and she sat with it flooding through her and understood, with the clarity of someone who has been given something back. They did not know how much they needed, what she had been carrying without knowing she was carrying it. She went to him. He was at the boarding house, which was where he usually was, the house that had been the setting for a significant portion of what they were to each other. She found him in the study, which was characteristic, and he looked up when she came in, and she saw him read her face in the instant before she said anything and understand what had happened. She crossed the room and she held his face in her hands, and she looked at him with the full weight of 2 years and a compulsion and a prison world and a death and everything the universe had arranged between them, and she said, "I remember." He closed his eyes, just briefly, a single second of letting something go that he had been holding with considerable effort for the months since he came back. Then he opened them and looked at her with the expression she had first seen in a winter bedroom, and which she now understood had been the face he wore when he had decided to stop being afraid of how much he felt. "All of it?" he said. "All of it," she said. "The road, the bedroom, the dance, the sacrifice, the bridge, all of it." He put his hands over hers, where they rested on his face, and they stayed like that for a moment that needed to be its own moment before anything else could happen. Then she kissed him, and the kiss had the weight of everything returned. All the history and the almost and the loss and the recovery compressed into the specific and irreplaceable fact of two people who had found their way back to each other through more than most people were required to survive. The cure arrived in their relationship's next chapter with the finality of a question that had been circling for 2 seasons and now required an answer. Delena took it. She made the decision with the fullness of her own reasoning, having thought it through carefully and at length, having sat with what it meant and what it cost and what it gave her. She wanted to be human. She had always wanted to be human. The life she had wanted since before the bridge was still the life she wanted, and the cure made it available, and she chose it. Damon's response to her choosing it was the most honest thing he had said to her since the night before the sacrifice, which was saying something, given the general honesty of their communication. "You're going to age," he said, not as a complaint, as a fact he was naming so that they could both look at it. "Yes," she said, "and I won't." "No," she said, "you won't." "And eventually," she said, "yes." He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet, because this was the thing that cost him most, and she understood that, and she was not going to minimize the cost by filling the silence with reassurance he had not asked for. "I would choose it anyway," he said finally. "Whatever time we have, I would choose it." She looked at him with everything she felt, which was considerable, which was amplified by no biology now because she was human, and the amplification was simply the natural result of what they were to each other. "I know," she said. "That's part of why I love you." The sleeping spell came without warning, in the way that the most devastating things tend to come. Joe's death at the wedding, Kai's revenge, specific and cruel and targeted at the people who had opposed him, was the detonator. The linking of Elena's life to Bonnie's was the punishment. While Bonnie lived, Elena would sleep, not die, not the permanent ending, not the irreversible kind, but unreachable, sealed inside an enchanted unconsciousness from which she could not be woken until Bonnie's natural life had run its course. Elena went to sleep in the Salvatore boarding house with Damon's hand in hers, and she did not know when she would wake up. Damon lost her again, this time to an enchantment rather than a death, to a sleep rather than an absence, but the loss had the same practical contours. She was not there, she was not reachable, and he was. He was alone with the fact of her in a coffin, and the knowledge that she was not dead, but might as well be, for the purposes of the daily life he was supposed to continue living. He had come back from the prison world. He had survived her forgetting him. He had watched her become human and had stayed anyway, and had chosen the temporary thing, because temporary with her was worth more than permanent without her. And now she was asleep, and he was awake, and the difference between those two states felt like the entire width of the world. He did not turn off his feelings. This was the choice that defined the 3 years that followed. Not the dramatic choice, not the externally visible heroism, but the daily private decision to keep feeling rather than go numb, to stay in the grief rather than dissolve it. He had known how to turn off. He had done it before. The switch was available, and there were days when its availability was the most significant fact in the room. He did not use it. He kept going. Stefan was his anchor, which required its own adjustment to the fraternal dynamics that had characterized their relationship since 1864. The brothers in a new configuration, working together without the triangle that had structured so much of the preceding years, finding what remained of their relationship when the shared context of Elena's presence was removed. What remained was considerable. What remained was 170 years of history and the specific and irreplaceable bond of people who had made each other who they were. Cade came. The devil mythology arrived in the final season with the accumulated weight of the show's supernatural history. An ancient being, the architect of hell, with a claim on the Salvatore brothers that predated Elena and extended back through decades of violence and blood. Stefan made a choice in the final season that cost him everything and gave Mystic Falls back what it was owed. A sacrifice made with the full understanding of what he was giving and the full love of someone who had decided that his life was the right price. She was not there for Stefan's death. She was asleep when her first love, the good brother, the person who had reached toward her in the cemetery when she was 17 and grief hollowed, made the choice that ended him. Damon carried this alone, the loss of Stefan, the complicated and irreducible grief of losing the person who had been his longest and most constant relationship. He carried it because there was no one else to carry it with who would have understood the specific weight of it. He carried it toward her. Bonnie found a way. That was the resolution that had always been coming. Bonnie Bennett, who had been the most powerful and most costly supernatural resource in Mystic Falls for 6 years, who had anchored herself to an other side and a prison world, and every magical structure the show had required someone to anchor, who had given more of herself to the preservation of other people's lives than was ever quite acknowledged. Bonnie found a way to break the linking spell without dying. She found it in the kind of place that solutions to impossible problems are found, through the sheer persistence of someone who refuses to accept that the available options are the only options. Elena woke up. She woke up in the Salvatore boarding house with Damon's hand still in hers, or in hers again, and the room was different and the light was different, and she understood immediately that time had passed, that the world she had gone to sleep in was not precisely the world she was waking into. She looked at him. He was there. He was right there, as he had apparently been for the entirety of the time she had been asleep. Not in the literal sense, not with his hand in hers through every moment of 3 years, but in the sense that mattered. He had not left. He had not gone numb. He had not found a way to make the waiting easier that involved forgetting what he was waiting for. He looked at her with the eyes she had first learned to read in a boarding house study over bourbon, and then in a winter bedroom, and then across a decade of rooms she could now access with the full weight of their history. He looked at her the way Damon Salvatore looked at her, which was its own specific thing that no one else had ever looked at her with. And she said his name and it was enough. They built a life. This is not a metaphor. They actually built one, in the ordinary and extraordinary way that people build lives when they have decided to spend them together. New York, for some of it, a city large enough to offer anonymity to a human and a vampire who preferred not to, explain their situation to curious neighbors, old enough to offer Damon the texture of history he moved through most comfortably. Elena finished her education, which she had always intended to finish, and worked in the direction of the medicine that had always been part of her imagined future. Damon, who had lived long enough to have acquired expertise in most things that interested him, found ways to be useful in the world that did not require explaining his nature to people unprepared to receive it. They grew old together, in the sense that she grew old and he stayed, which was the bargain they had made and renewed daily. She had grey in her hair before she had expected it, which she found more interesting than distressing. He looked at the grey with an expression she had catalogued as the one he wore when something moved him, and he was not performing the absence of being moved. "You're beautiful," he said, on a morning when she was examining the grey in the bathroom mirror, and he was standing in the doorway with coffee and the particular expression. "You have to say that," she said. "I have never," he said, "said anything I had to say." She laughed. The laugh that had surprised her in the early months of their relationship and had never stopped being one of her daily pleasures. She turned from the mirror and looked at him, at the face that had not changed since 1864, at the eyes she had been reading for years, at the person who had told her she deserved a love that consumed her before she knew his name, and had spent the intervening time being the person he was describing. The love that consumed her, adventure and passion, everything she wanted and nothing less. She had it. She had always been going to have it. The road had been long and the delays had been real, and the things placed between them had required genuine survival to navigate. But they had navigated it, both of them, from opposite directions and at their own reluctant pace, arriving at the same place because the same place was always where they were heading. Damon Salvatore arrived in Mystic Falls as the wrong choice, the bad brother, the darkness at the edge of someone else's love story. He left as the man who had chosen, every day and at considerable cost, to be more than what the darkness made him. Elena Gilbert thought she knew what love looked like. Steady, safe, uncomplicated. She found instead something that demanded everything, that was inconvenient and dangerous and completely, irreversibly hers. Neither of them chose wisely. Both of them chose truly. They were always heading toward each other, delayed by grief and compulsion and death and forgetting and the sheer weight of everything the world arranged between them. But arriving, always arriving, because that was the nature of the real thing. It did not require perfect conditions. It only required the willingness to keep moving toward it. So let that be the last thought you carry into sleep tonight, that the most honest things are said in the dark, that love, like sleep, does not ask you to understand it before you surrender. Close your eyes now, breathe slowly, and let Mystic Falls grow quiet behind you. You've heard the whole story. Rest now. It's enough. Good night.